Hello, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring the topic of Teshuva, repentance. Thank you so much to our series sponsor, our dearest friends, Daniel and Mira Stokar. I am so grateful for your friendship and support. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, that's 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Before we dive into this topic, I have to make a few very important disclaimers because this is an extraordinarily sensitive topic. To talk about infidelity, we can't really just jump right into an interview. I think it's really important to frame this in a proper way so we understand what and why we are talking about this. First and foremost, I just want to let our listeners know, if you're listening to this while you're doing carpool or you have youngins in the car, there's some mature language. We do not get into the lurid details. This is not voyeuristic. This is something very authentic and very real, but we don't get into lurid details, but we do at times use fairly mature language to talk about what is happening. So use your discretion on where you are playing this. It probably would not make, I think a lot of our episodes would not make great carpool listening, maybe with older children if you're listening, but for really young children, maybe hold off on this and find something else to listen to. Happy to give you some recommendations. So number one, really keep in mind we are going to be using fairly mature language. We're not using curse words. Don't get too excited. But we're using mature language, and you should keep that in mind. We are not getting into the lurid details over here. Aside from the fact that they're not particularly relevant, it's also inappropriate. We're not here for that. So why are we talking about this? It's easy to just have an open shut case and say, be a 5-minute podcast. Infidelity, adultery is a prohibition. It is one of the gravest sins we have in the entire Torah, which I think is a testament to the way we center family, especially in Jewish faith. It's an extraordinarily serious sin. It's mentioned in the Ten Commandments. In the Aseres Hadibros, it is mentioned in the Torah. It is a biblical prohibition. I assume most people are not tuning in to this podcast ever to know the details of prohibitions. I assume most of our listeners, most people know that God does not look kindly, that religious tradition does not look kindly on infidelity. I would always say, I used to say it goes without saying. I've learned more and more that nothing goes without saying. So I do want to say that in case anybody thinks that I don't understand how important this prohibition is. It's extraordinarily important. So why are we talking about this? People know it's prohibited. They know it's one of the 10 Commandments. This is part of nearly any religious faith community, is the understanding of how grave an issue, a prohibition, a sin of adultery is. So why on earth would we spend time talking about it? So there's something kind of at the heart of this issue, and even talking about this issue, that I've come back to a few times on this podcast, and that is both normalizing and not normalizing what we talk about. On one sense, I would like to hope, I don't have specific statistics, I would like to hope that most marriages within our community are fairly happy. I would like to hope that most people do not and would not ever commit adultery. It is not something that is normal. It is not something that's just a normal part of marital life. So is talking about it, so to speak, normalizing this prohibition? Are we kind of bringing it down and expanding people's overton window, which is kind of normalizing the possibilities, the extremes? The more you speak about something, the more different options come into focus. That is not what we are trying to do. At the same time, I don't know if it's fair to say that we are not trying to normalize it. Unfortunately, it is a reality in the course of any marriage. Every marriage has stresses. Every relationship has points of friction. And there is no question that desire and looking at somebody other than your spouse, desiring somebody other than your spouse, is something that people can feel over the course of a marriage. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing. That doesn't mean that it's normal. However, we need to be able to talk about this in order to strengthen our marriages, in order to make them even stronger, in order to help people who are starting either to feel that slow tug of erosion in their relationships, or, God forbid, people who have already crossed very important either halachic in Jewish law thresholds or thresholds of just the emotional relationships that they form. We live in the modern world. We don't live in a shtetl. We are interacting with more people from a wider variety of backgrounds that we have ever before, which doesn't mean that that is the cause of infidelity, but the options that we are exposed to, not even the possibilities of who, God forbid, would draw someone in to have a relationship outside of marriage, but even the conversations that we have in the workplace, even conversations that we have in adulthood, they're not the same conversations that you have when you're dating, when you're engaged in that first year of marriage, where even the possibility and the notion of breaking a marital vow seems so like outside of the realms of possibilities. I imagine that nearly every single person who listens to 1840 has somebody within their life, one degree of separation, who has struggled with this. Could be a parent, could be a family member, could be a friend that you know. So we already, in a sense, are exposed to this, yet we don't have enough language, resources, strategies, and ideas for how we can, number one, strengthen our own marriages, and more importantly, for people who do cross that threshold, and I assume that's a minority, a small minority of our listeners, though I honestly don't know, but for those who are, breaking certain boundaries, whether it's actual acts of infidelity or adultery, or even that emotional connection, I think it's important to talk about this so we're able to really better understand, number one, its devastating effect, and number two, how we can take steps in our own lives to strengthen our relationships. And in that sense, this conversation is relevant. It's relevant to all of our listeners because all of our relationships, whether or not we are married or not, can use strengthening, and whether or not we are in a committed relationship or hope to one day be in a committed relationship, the work that goes in to ensure that we are able to form long-lasting, rich relationships in our lives means that we don't wait till something goes wrong to talk about this. But being able to surface this, discuss it, is something that I think is our responsibility to begin even now, even for people who are not yet married. It reminds me in many ways, and my grandmother would, I believe it's her yahrzeit today. It is her yahrzeit today as I'm recording this. My grandmother was not very political, but there was one president who, I don't even know all the details why, but she did not like him. So she would not be happy that I'm quoting him on her yahrzeit, and that is President Jimmy Carter. My grandfather had a picture. My grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Bekritsky, my grandmother's name was Dorothy, and my grandfather got to meet Jimmy Carter, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world growing up, having a picture of your grandfather with the President of the United States. And my grandmother, anytime I would be like, wow, that's so cool, Grandpa met President Jimmy Carter, would use that as an opportunity to say all the reasons why she did not like Jimmy Carter and did not look at that picture with the same esteem that I did. However, leaving my grandmother's politics aside, Jimmy Carter, he should have a refuah shalema. It should go well. I know he's just a recent interview that his grandson said he's in the final chapter of his life. He's still with us. But there was a very moving interview that was kind of quite famous where he was asked by a reporter, because he was such a devout Christian, he was asked by a reporter whether or not he had ever committed adultery. And his response was really interesting. He said, I've committed adultery in my heart many times. And that's a fairly sophisticated response, and one that I don't think most people would admit to. Most people, if they see somebody who they're attracted to, aside from their spouse, they don't come home at the end of the day and their wife how'd your day go? Well, by the way, I saw this and this person on the subway, and I saw this and this person at work. We're not usually talking about that. I'm not saying that that's an actual act of adultery, but it's very hard to admit that in our hearts can stray and do stray. And whether or not it actually crosses the threshold where that emotional relationship metastasizes into something much worse, and you cross a real boundary with somebody who you are not married to and break that marital vow and all of the devastating repercussions that come out from that, is really besides the point, because this is work that we are all and should be involved in making sure that at the heart of the Jewish community, the heart of all of our communities, that family unit and our marital vows and commitments are able to be strengthened. And the strength of our marriages should not dwindle over time, but should be able to get stronger. So we're talking about this for two reasons. Number one, to really understand the devastating effect that this can have on somebody's life. And number two, to better appreciate what steps we can all take to ensure that these issues don't metastasize and don't erode the most important relationships we have in our lives. And in order to do that, we have two very important conversations that I want to introduce you to. The first is an anonymous conversation. It's an anonymous conversation with someone who reached out to me a while back, really just to share their appreciation for 1840 and the role that it played in their life. It was an extraordinarily moving message, and it was from somebody who I knew. Wasn't somebody directly close to me, but somebody I knew. I recognized their name right away. And I was actually quite surprised, because this person was kind of the bastion of what I would call normal, like normal in every sense of the word, normal religiously, communally, just like totally normal. And usually, I'll be honest, the people who reach out to me to talk about how much 1840 has changed their lives, they're certainly not normal. You're all normal who reach out to me, but they're going through something. There's a reason why what we talk about has resonated in the way that it did. There's something very real, something very difficult, something maybe painful, a struggle that they've either in the midst of or that they've overcome that is propelling them to reach out. And this person reached out of the clear blue sky. Just, it was a really heartfelt message. And I was like, oh, that's really nice. I always love hearing from listeners. I always love when people reach out, especially with a kind word. But many people, you could reach out. I love hearing people who are critical and have feedback and tell me how we can improve and how we can be better. But the fact that this person reached out was already a hint that something was deteriorating in this person's life. And we began talking, and we've been in touch quite closely over the past little bit. And after sharing with me, and this is somebody who, again, from a distance, seemed to have their lives completely together in every sense of the word. And this person disclosed to me that this was a major issue in their lives, being faithful, somebody who did in fact commit an act of adultery, many acts of adultery. And that's why I think it's important to listen to kind of a first-hand perspective, how this person conceives of what went wrong, how this person conceives of where their lives needed to be addressed, and really the steps to take, both to pick up the shards of your life in the aftermath of something like this happening, and figuring out, despite the devastating effects that these decisions have on our lives and all the people around us, figure out a way forward, and understanding that our Torah and Jewish values and Teshuva itself is not just to restore perfection. It is not just for a perfect world. When God decided to give us the Torah, there is a famous Talmudic exchange in the tractate Shabbos where the angels actually were jealous. They were upset. Why are you giving Moshe the Torah to give to the Jewish people? We should have it. We are supernal. We are angelic. We are transcendent. We should be the ones to have the Torah. And God started reading from the Torah and said, look what's written in here. It says, don't commit adultery, don't commit murder. These aren't the issues that you struggle with. These are very human struggles. These are struggles of a world of imperfection, a world in need of redemption. And I think when we reflect on some of the ugliness in our lives, we have to realize that concepts of Teshuva, concepts of Torah, they are not to restore perfection, but they are meant to address those crevices of our lives that we hold secrets, the burdens of our lives, the suffering, the pain in our lives that ultimately are the most imperfect in our lives. That is where Torah is meant to address, to elevate, and to become transcendent, but not to retain a transcendence. We were not created perfect. And if you look throughout history, the issues that rabbis were addressing in response to literature were not about happy little families. This is not a new problem. This is a problem that has existed throughout Jewish history, whether it's the Jews serving idols or families being devastated with issues of infidelity. The Torah has always been meant to address the imperfections of our lives and help us strive and reach towards perfection. And that is why it is my absolute privilege and pleasure to share a very painful but very real conversation with somebody who's willing to step forward. They are obviously anonymous. We have changed their voice, but I think it's still not just bearable, but easy to listen to. And somebody who really opened up about their lives and their struggles with this matter, with infidelity, with this avera, what's known as a sin, a transgression, a crossing of the boundaries, and the effect that it had on their lives. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Anonymous. Okay, let's really dive into it. We first got in contact probably a year, maybe even a year ago. You reached out. You were a listener. We know each other from before, and you sent me one of the most thoughtful voice notes that really I could ever dream of or want, where you were saying that the stories that we share really had an impact on you, and we've been in touch since then about your own story and sharing your own story. And I just want to say up front, what I want to share is a very honest and real portrait of somebody's struggles and what that means, especially in the context of Teshuva. And to understand that, obviously, for a host of reasons, I think anonymity is the best way to approach this. It allows you to share without, fear of, the context and people who may know you from the outside, and also kind of share in a very honest and authentic way without, sometimes people share, they want the self-aggrandizement, they want the attention and the story. This is very, very much a pure interview about the story of somebody's struggles. So really, from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me on.
I want to start at the beginning, at the very, very beginning. For when you realized that you had inclinations, you had desires that put you maybe outside of what you, I guess, think, because it's so hard to know, but suspected was outside of the norm. All of us struggle with different things. All of us struggle with different lust desires. For sure, in high school, this is, extraordinarily difficult for, you reach puberty and you're trying to figure things out. People definitely struggle, and there's so much more information and education around this. I'm curious for you, when do you look at the beginning of this story that you are in now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would go back to even the beginning of puberty, really. I would say that I had a very bad relationship with my struggles. I didn't realize that I wasn't the only person who was masturbating. I hope it's okay that I'm being very explicit here.
Yeah, I wanted you to use, we could use real terminology for sure.
Yeah. So I thought that I was alone in these struggles from ever since I discovered what it was, what masturbation was. I felt like nobody knew what I was going through. Nobody knew that I enjoyed it, that I started to do it very often. That's something that's really stands out in my memory as the beginning of this.
So you go through high school, and to all, I guess, your image, I assume nobody had any idea. You were, your image was just like a very good,
Good guy.
solid person.
That is,
Good guy.
yeah. Fast forward like 40 years, and I think that's the biggest problem I struggled with was my image of being a good boy, a good guy, solid guy.
Solid
I sort
guy
of like
does it right. Yeah.
people pleaser, if you can be blunt about it. But I was just always giving off this image of I struggled with that. You know, I didn't feel I felt that I didn't provide any value in any other area of my life. I think I had a lot of self-esteem issues. So, I wasn't a good student particularly. I wasn't, I was okay at sports, but wasn't like great. And I was just like there, and what I felt that I gave to the world was just being a good guy, good boy from a young age, from my parents. Like
So
that's
your contribution was the image rather than
exactly
you felt that way, meaning the veneer, the surface look is like what I contribute is just like, being the 10th man in the minion, so to speak,
right.
like this faceless, good person, reliable, you could count on. And meanwhile, underneath the surface, there was so much unfolding. So let's fast forward. Take me through where, until now, what you're describing, to be perfectly honest with you, sounds extraordinarily normal.
Yes.
You're discovering pornography. You are discovering masturbation. That this is a very normal part of high school. This is a very normal part of adolescence and post puberty. When do you think you began to discover more that, like, wait, this is dysfunctional behavior? I am not functioning in the same way that I'm supposed to function.
Well, first of all, I never did. I never looked at myself in the mirror. I learned to bury every emotion that I had. I will say that a lot of the perspective that I have is all looking back, right? With everything I know now, looking back. So it's very difficult to talk about how I felt in the moment. But I'll say that once I discovered pornography and masturbation, I think that there are people who have a very healthy relationship with it. If again, I'm not talking from a halachic perspective, but people who
Correct.
use it because it's pleasurable. And then there are people, I think, like me, who it becomes. I think every emotion was sexualized. First of all, anytime I felt any bad emotion, I had to study for a test and I didn't want to do it. So it's like I just swallowed it and all my emotions went towards that channel, if that makes any sense. And I learned to just suppress everything and not be honest about it. Like it's something that I was very embarrassed about. I had a lot of shame about it from ever since the beginning. And I never spoke to anyone about it. I know a lot of people who spoke to Rebbeim and were very open about these struggles. But for me, it was like, you don't talk about any of this stuff.
It's so interesting to hear the way you talk about it. I don't think I've ever, spoken about this publicly, but I struggled for a long time with nicotine addiction, with cigarettes. And I remember speaking to a therapist. I was so embarrassed about it. Like it was, and I remember I had a therapist who told me they used a terminology that I still think of today. Like they said, this is a ritual for you. It's a ritualistic escape. Like right away when you feel certain emotions, this is exactly where you need to go. And the using the term ritual, which is usually to describe like religious endeavors, but like this was the only measure that gave me that feeling of escape, and then like your life feels like it's turning or spinning or out of control. This gave me a sense of control. Like I was describing, I was the opposite of a social smoker. It was deeply private because that was the ritual. That's what allowed me to move forward. And I was so embarrassed by it. Not just because my father was an oncologist, but like it was just like it was bummy. And in the same way, that image of like what you want to depict to the public, I'm like, I don't want to be seen as like a bum. I want to be seen as a good guy. and therefore you made it this very private escapist ritual. So what happened next?
Yeah, I
You
also
have
just I
this.
want to address something that you mentioned because you sort of made the comparison between this and an addiction to nicotine or
Yes.
anything like that. And I want to state off the bat that like I did over the past few years, I did explore whether I have an addiction. I joined a few meetings. I had a
SA.
sponsor.
You
I
went.
did
You went to
SA,
SA. Yeah.
Sexaholics Anonymous, and I also did SLAA, which is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, which is like a little
Okay.
twist. And I would say that there's a lot of resources there that help me a lot. But in the end of the day, I
Okay.
don't know that what I have is an addiction per se, which I think does help when I talk to people about this. Now that I'm quite open about it, even though I want it to be somewhat anonymous, but I speak to people about this, and and it helps when I don't use the words like I don't know if it's an addiction or not. I want to, yeah,
Why does that help? Could you tell me? Because you made that when right before the interview started, I used the term sex addiction, and you stopped me. I don't think you're embarrassed at this point between me and you. Like we're having this conversation. It's going to be anonymous. Why do you think that even the ambiguity around that terminology,
sure.
at least in your life, is
Sure.
helpful?
I actually say it because I think it puts more responsibility on me. In the rooms, from my experience, I'm talking about
And when you
that
say rooms, I'm familiar with that.
SA.
The rooms is, yeah, the rooms. I happen to love that language that you're referring
Yeah,
to the rooms, meaning that's in the AA, shared universe. The meetings that people go to are referred to as the rooms.
exactly. So in the rooms, in these rooms, um, I've seen people use it as sort of a crutch, sort of an excuse. Again, I'm not pointing fingers. I don't want to make anyone feel bad or offend
Yeah,
anyone, but um, I don't like to use it because, first of all, I spoke to a few therapists about it, and they all said they don't believe that I'm an addict. They believe that I have other issues that I'm working on and working through. But when you call it an addiction, it's sort of like, oh well, this is the way I am, and I don't need to. I could sort of pawn off the responsibility. There are people who a
to
lot
the
of the
to the
people,
label.
yeah, to the label.
It's
A
the
lot of
label's fault.
exactly. I just have this issue, so therefore it's a problem. Like therefore I can't be blamed so much. Especially people who have certain tendencies in a marriage and then speak to their spouse about it, and then they talk about how it's an addiction. It's sort of like, well, I did these bad things to you. I went out and I paid for sex. I was masturbating behind your back. I was doing all these things, meeting up with women, but it's because of the addiction. I'm sick, and and I don't. It helped me to think like that for a while when I was in my worst. I would say going through the worst part of this. It helped me, but at this point, I don't think that I have a true addiction.
Okay. I really appreciate the disclaimer, and take me through to the next. Again, we're still, in this unfolding story, we're still, in my eyes, we're still in high school adolescence experimenting.
Exactly.
In your narrative, if you were to kind of chart out the changes and how this, kind of overwhelmed your life, where do you look at the first time, after the beginning, that you began to realize this is more than a high school kid's lack of self control? This is more than a typical person exploring their body and, looking at lust or desire, or what we call in kind of the yeshiva world, your taiva.
Yeah.
When did you realize this is definitely a step beyond
Yeah.
that?
Okay. Also, I want to make a disclaimer that I don't know that the early part of my life with masturbation and pornography is necessarily what caused me to live out a life of years of infidelity. Okay, I don't want to say that one led to the other. So there's the part of adolescence, and I did struggle with all these things. Um, when I realized that I never realized there was a problem because I didn't want to look at myself in the mirror. From a young age, I learned that um, I really just buried everything and move on. That was like the lifestyle I grew up with.
Yeah.
That's something I learned from my parents. That like you sort of just you bury it and you just move on. You like ignore if like
Yeah.
you
Be a good guy.
be a good guy and just move on. Like 90% of me was I felt like 90% of me was good, and then like there was like 10% of me that was just like bad that I locked in a box and put it on the side. I would like to describe when things got out of control, which was really
Yes.
a few years after I got married. Now, I got married, and the person I married, um, amazing person, and we got along very well. But I kept a facade. I kept up a facade for her. She came from a very, I would say, innocent background, and I wasn't open with her. Like she thought that when I said that I had masturbated in the past, she thought that it was something that I did once or twice in my life, literally.
Oh wow,
Not
that's
that,
like very
yeah,
innocent.
I was not. It was, she was innocent. I wasn't open with her. I think that to a certain extent, I told lies, white lies. I just didn't reveal information from a very early age.
But can I push back
Yeah,
because I am not of the school of thought where in order to get married you need to like list out every time that you've like, hey, how was work today? By the way, I was on a subway and I saw a very beautiful woman and I started having inappropriate thoughts and when I was in 11th grade I did this and so I'm not a big proponent of like radical disclosure to a spouse. I don't think that's necessary or even healthy
I,
in a relationship.
I,
So,
I hear that. I would say that maybe that speaks to you, but me as a person, something I learned about myself is that I just want to be seen. I just want to be like open. I would love for like everyone to know all of my struggles, all of the bad things about me, or bad things with quotes, obviously,
yeah.
and just accept me for it. For me, the best thing that I could have done from an early age is just be open with everyone. Yeah, like I'm an oversharer, um, and not being honest when I think that I was in a relationship with this woman that I eventually married. If I feel that she thinks one thing about me and I know something else and that's not the truth, then to me, even that feels dishonest. It's weird because I lived out a life of infidelity, but that is, that's really like, that's the way I am. Like, I need to feel like
I
I'm being
like what the
totally
language you
honest.
use. I like the language you use to feel fully seen. And if that's something, if your relationship to your struggles, and I'm not trying to plug my own book, but I did write a book on sin and failure in Jewish thought. But if your relationship with your struggles is in some like black box that can't be penetrated and just like stays buried underneath, and yeah, you have an unhealthy, it's going to lead to an unhealthy relationship to your struggles. And for you, I understand why there was this, I guess, this sense even early in the marriage that like, did you have that feeling
I
that
had a feeling that I
I'm
was hiding something. I definitely had a feeling
you
that, yeah,
uh-huh.
I did look at pornography. I'd stopped for a while. Like it's always been a struggle for me. Um, I think in yeshiva, the second year I went to yeshiva, I've like the longest streak in my life was like 3 or 4 months that I did it. And I remember that once that finally like I failed, it killed me. It was like such a failure. Um,
Yeah.
and so I was able to, at the beginning of the marriage, I was able to, I would say, suppress a lot of my needs. Um, and I still felt like I wasn't being honest, but it was fine. Things were great. Um,
You're a good guy.
yeah, and something I also realized that was a big drive for me. Um, I loved attention from women. I know, especially, I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and they all can identify with that. Like, I just always loved it in high school. I never realized how much like I craved it. And I guess you could say that I was a bit of a flirt, but in high school I didn't have physical relationships with women, believe it or not. Um, And even with my ex-wife, we didn't touch before marriage. And I felt that I was just I was hiding something, but okay. So things
Yeah.
rolled. Through work, I guess I'd flirted with a few women. It wasn't anything I would say that was too dangerous, but there was one person that sort of took me over the ledge. She came on to me very aggressively, but I did not push her away. This happened. This happened many years ago, and something happened with her physically where I felt like I crossed the line, which really killed me. I felt terrible about it, and what I did was that night I came home and I couldn't look my wife in the eye, and she could tell that there was something wrong, um, and I decided to sort of come clean. And what I did was I told her that something happened, but I didn't tell her the truth. I lied about it. Instead of making it, let's say 50-50 on me, 50 on the woman, I made it seem like it was, 99% the woman. I didn't tell her exactly what happened. Um, and essentially I lied about it. Now, what I decided that moment was, okay, so I didn't tell her the full truth, but like I'm going to stop this, like this is over, and I'm gonna just go back to being a good guy. I didn't consider talking to anyone, like a therapist, anyone, disclosing this to anyone. I just said, okay, I'm gonna keep rolling, and I'm gonna, this is over. Like that part of my life is over. I'm not talking to a woman again. Um, and lo and behold, a few months later, I had cut off contact with that woman, um, but I found myself. I shouldn't say I found myself. I messaged this woman again after a few months, and
Just this is a few months
a
later.
few months later,
Was there a trigger in your own life that like you're bored one night? Like, what's the trigger
yeah,
in the context that has you seeking this
very
again?
difficult to look back on this, but something that I know now that I struggle with very much throughout my life, and I never knew what it was. Anxiety. I have. I actually I take medication for it now, which has helped me a lot. But um, I, I think that there was a lot of anxiety in my life. Being married, having a job, having kids, there was just a lot. And no, it wasn't. I don't think it was boredom per se. I think that there's just like the escape
From
that I mentioned.
responsibilities, it piles up.
Yeah, and yeah, and I also have certain sort of this issue in my own life where it's like out of sight, out of mind. Like if I'm working late at night and I'm alone in a room, I feel like I'm alone in the world. And I felt like that. I was working late. I just found myself getting in contact with this woman again, and
Yeah.
I always played dumb in my head. I said, okay, it's going to be innocent. Like I'm just going to like reach out to them, which is obviously crazy thinking, but
Yeah.
that's what I did. And so I
Can
messaged
I
this woman.
ask?
Yeah.
Was this woman Jewish? Not Jewish? Was that a factor in
It
this?
was not a factor. I was very careful over the years. Um, these were never. They were all Jewish, but no one that anyone knew. Like no one in my life
Oh,
knew. Um,
gotcha.
yeah, this wasn't like a family we had over for Shabbos meals.
Gotcha.
This was
Can I
like
ask? Is this somebody who's married?
this is someone who was divorced at the time. Someone I met through
Okay.
work, through my line of work.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and this was the first woman. And I'll make a long story short, but essentially, it's interesting. You can probably quote the Gemara that the rabbis say that when you sin twice, it becomes mutter in your eyes. It becomes
Nasa Yeah, that when you are shown about avera, when you repeat a sin, naasalo keheter, it appears that it is permissible. It's wild that you brought this up. This conversation was not supposed to be plugging my books or my sefer, but here we are. Um, I wrote before I published my book Synagogue, I wrote a Hebrew work called Beroges Rachem Tizkor, which was a Hebrew work that also explored sin and failure in Jewish thought. It's in Hebrew, and I have an essay specifically on that passage in Talmud because it's a fascinating passage because the Talmud says if you repeat a sin twice, nasalo keheter, which translates as it becomes permissible, and then the Talmud asks, like it's actually permissible, like that can't be, and then the Talmud says no, it appears as if it's permissible. It's not actually permissible. So I have an essay explaining the initial thought of the Gemara, no, what's called the Hava Amina, and then the conclusion of the Gemara, what's known as the Maskana. Meaning the Gemara presents it as if you do something twice, it's now permissible. And then the Talmud's like, wait, like for real? Like it's actually permissible? And then the Talmud's like, no, it feels as if it's permissible. So what changed in that initial thought and what changed in the conclusion is something I have an essay on, and I think it relates to kind of the parameters of our own free will, what we actually consider.
Yeah.
That something can actually feel permissible. It comes back to what you said about addiction, where you feel like this is outside of my sphere of control.
Right.
I am actually not responsible for this because I've become an addict. So you can have that label, which in the initial thought of the Talmud says that this is actually permissible for me.
Right. So the way I understand what the rabbis were saying was not that, again, like you said, it's not that it becomes permissible, and not even that it's like, oh, I have a problem. But in my own eyes, the way I saw myself was like, okay, you mess up once, it could happen to anyone. Okay, maybe not to this extent, but you mess up with something small, and okay, that's fine. But when you do it the second time, it's like, okay, like that's from that moment I saw myself as, I labeled myself as a sinner, a cheater. Like there was
this is who you are.
This is who I am. This is who I am. And like my life sort of bifurcated. There was like I mentioned before, there was a 90% of me that was good. Like I was a great guy. I was doing daf yomi. I was waking up at 5:30 in the morning to go to do daf yomi before minyan. Like I was like going to 3 minyanim a day. Like I was just a great guy, And yet there was this part of me that was doing these bad things. So I saw it as like, it wasn't that I saw that it was mutter, it was permissible in my eyes. It was that I just accepted that I'm a failure.
This is who I am. This is now a real part of my life. So after the second time, you're still married. You didn't really explain what your wife's reaction was even after the first time, even though you didn't fully disclose what had happened.
Right. Well, first of all, I'll mention that I don't know if it makes a difference. I never had full intercourse with any of the women over the years.
Okay.
I think that gave me a big insight to what was driving me. I don't think it was the sex itself, which is why another reason why I don't believe that I have a sex addiction. But it was more like the feeling needed, the feeling wanted, the chase. And the first time when I told my wife about what had happened, I didn't tell her the full story. So she was more shocked that I even felt bad. Like she was, for a few days, she was like, "Are you sure that that's all that happened? Because you seem to feel really guilty about this." But I put on a good show, and I kept the lie going. Like we had a bit of like distance for a few days, but it really like we got past it very quickly. And from that point on, she had no idea what was going on. I was I was always a very present father, very present husband. She worked more hours than I did, so I was home with the kids more. This is not like I went away on business trips for for nights. This was like I fit it in random slots, and it was something that went on for years. So anyways, when the second thing happened, like I just sort of like I accepted that I am a certain way. And each time that something happened, every message that I sent, I would say even every time that like I looked at pornography throughout this time, it was always like, okay, that's it. That's the last time. I said
Yeah.
that 1,000 times over the years. Like it was just repeated over and over and over again. And I never once thought like, okay, look at yourself in the mirror. I just accepted like I am digging myself into a deeper hole. My wife will never know about it. We have a great relationship that, like, from the outside and even from her perspective, she was in the happiest marriage of her life. We were one of those couples that people said they want to be like us. And throughout this time, this is what would happen. There was essentially this pattern that I described with the first woman. It was like basically three, I would say three incidents with them, maybe three meetups, something like that, maybe three or four, maybe two. And I would call it off with them, or they would just say, you're not up for something real. I would flake out on them a lot. Because again, a lot of it was the chase, but I felt like I had to
Yeah.
sort of meet up with them at some point. So I would meet up three or four times, and cut it off with that person. A few months would go by. Sometimes even like a year or two would go by without anything happening with a woman. And it wasn't like I said, "Oh, I finished with one. I need to move on to the next." This was like
Yeah.
I stopped and I said, "Okay, I'm done with this." And then 3 or 4 months later, there was something, I don't know, something inside of me that just went for something. And this
Yeah.
happened with about this happened for 10 years. With overall, it was I had some sort of relationship with 8 women over the years. I had no idea. I actually expressed to most of these women, like, I didn't know why I was doing it. I had no idea why I was doing what I was doing. It wasn't for the. I'll say it wasn't for the emotional side. It wasn't like I felt like I needed something there, or at least that I was in touch with. And I also felt fulfilled in an intimate way in my marriage, which is also very difficult for me to understand why I was doing what I was doing. But there I was.
Can I ask you, before we kind of get to the next stage of the story? You
Yeah.
had mentioned paying for sex. Was that
No.
within this 10-year period?
No, actually, something that I crave is realness, feeling wanted by
Yeah.
a real human being. So I couldn't. That wasn't never something that I ever wanted to do. I never went to. I know people who went to strip clubs and things like that. That was never something that I desired.
So you never did that.
No.
Okay. So this was really you said the chase, the transgressive
Yeah.
relationships with just repeated infidelity.
Yeah.
Were all the different instances the same context of just like meeting somebody either through work or through somebody who and then slowly becoming more and more transgressive until
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
you're you're in an appropriate relationship?
Yeah. I was very careful about it. So there's this way to that I sort of pushed the buck with each person. It was like, okay, so I'm not gonna. You don't come out right away and say that you're looking for something, but you open up a conversation and you see if they're open to it, and then yeah, sort of just push in and see if there's any way for you to get them to open up.
So take me kind of to the end. I mean, sadly, your marriage did not survive this. When did you had 10 years where you're hiding this secret? The only disclosure you had was the first incident, and you're only sharing little bits and pieces. When did you finally come totally clean?
Yeah, so
Were you caught? Did you just it just weigh on you too heavily? How did this come to a close?
um, I essentially was caught. What happened was about 4 months after the last thing that had happened, the last incident that had happened with someone, this person happened to have been married, and this woman's husband had seen a text message between her and a friend of hers talking about something that happened with me. And he confronted his wife, and she told him what had happened. And then he called my wife. He called her one day, and she was in denial. Like, she said, "You have no idea. Like, this is not my husband. Like, you have the wrong person. My husband's obsessed with me. He would never do something like this to hurt me." But he described certain details about who I was as a person, like, and she didn't tell me about this conversation. She just came home and asked to see my phone. That's when I could tell you the date, and since then everything has unraveled.
You knew the moment she asked for your phone that
Well,
what she was looking
yeah,
for.
listen, I was very careful over the years. Like, I deleted a lot of things, but there was still, I there was still evidence on there that you could find that there was something going on. And anyways, so that night I essentially, after her pushing and pushing and pushing, begging me to be honest with her, I was honest about this last woman. But in my head, I was like, okay, so I still, maybe one woman is not so bad, and it's something that we can get through. But, she kept saying, it's interesting, she remembered what had happened 10 years before.
She did.
She remembered, she said, one second, remember, like, what had happened all those years ago? Are you sure that's all that happened then? And, even if that is all that happened, are you sure nothing else has happened since then? And I kept up a facade. I kept up the lies. I said nothing had happened. I had told her the original truth back many years ago. And at this point, after the 10 years, I was honest about this person, this one woman. But I kept up a lie. I kept denying it. And I came clean about pornography, masturbation, all the things that I thought that she could handle. Selfishly, I said that, things could be okay between us eventually. I had no idea what was going to happen if I keep up these lies. But anyways, for the next 2 days, it was just very difficult. Her life was unraveling. Mine was unraveling.
Sure.
Our kids, who thought that their parents had the happiest relationship in the world, saw us fighting suddenly. We'd go into the room and have like important talks. We'd close the door, and it wasn't until 2 days later that, and also my wife then she was really begging me to come clean and tell her anything that I had, that, just be honest with her. So 2 days later, I said to myself, okay, it's now or never. If I want to change, if I felt that I was given sort of an opportunity to change. And I said, if I'm going to, it's now or never. So I opened my mouth, and it just came pouring out. I told her about everything that had happened over the previous 10 years. Even in the middle of this, it was like very traumatic for both of us. She's like, I just have to go to work. I can't hear anymore. And she started driving away, and I called her back. I said, like, there's more. Like, just come back upstairs. I need to tell you, I came clean about everything that had gone on over the 10 years. And that's essentially when everything broke. Now, over the next few weeks, there was a lot of hope.
On your end, meaning
on both of our ends. I mean, I felt amazing. There was like this burden that was off my shoulder. I mean, I was crying. I was bawling on the floor when I was telling her all this stuff, and it was the first time I cried in 10 years. Like, there was a lot of physical toll this took on me, as well as emotional, and it felt amazing to be able to come clean. Um, she said one of the first things she said to me was like, "Find a therapist. Like you need to find someone." It was so literally the next day I started seeing someone. I
Because
haven't.
you wanted the marriage to continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, so I found a therapist, started seeing them some of the next day, and over the next few weeks, you know, there was distance between me and my wife. Obviously, like you can't possibly hear a news like that and
Yeah.
just smooth it over. But we were both listening to podcasts, things about infidelity and desires and things like that, and we were being very honest and open. And she was talking about how I mean, she just couldn't believe what she was hearing. Um, but there seemed to be a little bit of hope there because it seemed like I think her story was okay. Like right now, I can't even look at you, but okay, you came clean. Like maybe there's some sort of hope. I mean, she was broken. I need to be very clear about that. She was having an incredibly hard time. It's something that I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy.
Sure.
So it seemed like things like there might be some sort of ability to, let's say, repair this. But as time went on, we grew further apart. I mean, I was there really waiting for her to say, "Okay, we can work on this. This is something I can get through." But she just never got to that point. Um, and as time went on, um, she was staying at work later. You know, she couldn't be home. She just couldn't be in the same
Sure.
house as me, in the same room as me. Um, she was she always worked late, but she was now coming home at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. I mean, really, there was very little ability that she had to be around me and to deal with this. And um, it got to a point where after a few months, um, I said, like, look at this, like, look at what's going on here. She had mentioned the words like separation. Maybe she had spoken about like maybe we should try something like that. But I was in denial. I thought I was just waiting for that one moment when she comes home and says, "Okay, give me a hug. Like let's hold
We're
hands and
back.
walk into the sun. Into the sunset happily ever after."
Because I think what's interesting is you had lived for 10 years with both of these personalities, so you were familiar with both. So for you, you finally like unified yourself
Exactly.
and
That's it.
pieced yourself back together. And she is now living for the first time in her whole life since knowing you with this other part of you that is deeply foreign and alienating and was incredibly damaging to the commitments of your marriage. So it makes sense to me that you're like, okay, could we get back to like what it was? Like I just introduced you to this part of me, and she's like, I need a little bit more time to process this. I know you know this side of you. I never met them.
Yeah, you described it perfectly. Like that's exactly the way she described it, and that's the exact way that I went through it. Um, I felt like there were these two sides of me that now come together, and I was like whole, and I could share myself with her. This is who I am, and not who I am. Like accept it, and I'm going to continue doing these things in the future. But let's work on this together. You now know who I am, but and it was very repairing for me. It was very healing, or at least a step in the healing process for me. But for her, this was exactly like you described. Like what I was living with someone I had no idea who they are, and it was extremely traumatic for her.
So tell me, you had mentioned that you had gone to SA. Once this comes out, you first started therapy. I'm curious, did the therapist recommend SA to you, um, or that was a separate part of this? Is that something that's more recent?
No, that
How did
was
your
yeah, that was something separate. They were all I've had two therapists over the years. They were both pretty. I think that if they were honest, they didn't really care for the fact that I was doing SA because they, from their perspective, I didn't have an addiction, and so.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I wasn't sure if I had an addiction. It was something that I asked them almost every session. Um, so no, this was something. Basically, what happened was after a few weeks, after I originally came clean to my wife, I had gotten together with an old friend who had become a Rebbe since a childhood friend, someone I grew up with.
Okay.
And you know those people that you just like feel know you, and even though you haven't spoken to them in years, this is someone who
I
off the
I
grid, and I just felt like I could.
I've had I am blessed to have a few of those too. I mean, my friends Yoni and Akiva. I remember one time, I something was going on in my life. It wasn't even traumatic. It was just like something weighing on me, and I literally was like, "There's only one person I could speak this," and I drove out like 2 hours to just get together with Yoni and just go on a walk and talk, and almost like it, to me sometimes it's like you I feel sometimes like an archaeologist, like could we excavate who I was, because I forget like what was I in 10th grade, what was I in 11th grade. I need somebody to bridge the different parts of my story, this like time lapse that is life itself, and bridge these different images together. I need somebody who knows me throughout, and like to go on a walk and to kind of connect. I mean, it's the holiest and sweetest type of friendship that I'm so grateful. Not everybody has childhood friends, but I am always incredibly grateful to mine. So you got together
Yeah,
with this friend, okay?
and this was the first time I disclosed this information to anyone besides my wife and besides my therapist. And it was something that, as someone who struggled with trying to give off this image of like a good guy, it was very difficult for me to speak. Um, but I had spoken to him about it. I think, and of course, like, as you can imagine, no one was like, get out of my house, you're a terrible person, get away from me. Everyone showed incredible support and real like understanding, and just where it was just so amazing about the whole process I was going through. And I think he mentioned the words to me, addiction, at some point. Okay, I sort of shelved that idea for the time being because if you ask me, I'm sort of the type of person who likes to take responsibility on my own shoulders, and I felt that was sort of pushing it off. But then a few months later, I had spoken to a friend of mine who was a therapist. I also was very close friends with him in college, and he was the one who really said, I think you might have an addiction. Um, it's worth looking into it. And he said, and this was at this point, um, I was already mentioning the words that me and my wife might be separating. So he said, if you go to these types of meetings, he kind of said, it might be a good excuse for you. Not really excuse, but if there is a real issue here and you have an addiction, so maybe this is something that, can help her understand a little more about you. She can go to the meetings for her and people who are dealing with people with addictions and understand a little more. So that was really the first time I thought about going to some sort of meeting, and I went. It was an incredible experience. I mean, I came clean to a room of like 20 people um, who were
Are
struggling.
SA meetings gender separated?
No, this was with men and women. There are a lot more
That's
men, as you can imagine, and yeah, I think the idea is that when you come clean about having some sort of addiction, there's less of people feel there's less of a risk of something happening. Although
uh
I
huh.
know that it does happen. Anyways, I went to a room. I it was they call it a newcomers meeting where the newcomer
Sure.
person for the first time, they basically have the floor for a half hour, 45 minutes to just tell their story. And I said everything, it came clean, and it really was a healing experience in and of itself. And I continued going to these meetings on a weekly basis, and I took a sponsor. I was very serious about it. Although at the same time, I wasn't 100% convinced that I was an addict, but there was something that helped me, and I was going through a very difficult time in my life. So this was something that
Essay
helped.
in general, I'm just curious if you know or could clarify. You know, the difficulty is that you can live a very fine life without any alcohol or without any drugs. You could take it down to zero. But I'm just curious in SA, like, is the goal to not have any either masturbation or sex outside of the context of a relationship, to take that down to zero, especially for somebody who's been struggling with this for so long, could be a very difficult goal. Meaning, especially somebody who's married and is struggling with infidelity. Like, I could imagine both psychologically and even honestly halachically, they do write about this in, it's right there in Shulchan Aruch and with the commentaries of Shulchan Aruch, where it is probably recommendable, if you feel that urge and desire, to rather look at pornography rather than commit infidelity.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, if in the rooms, do they have a regimen where, like, the goal is like totally zero?
Yes. So there are two types of meetings that I know of for sex addicts. So one is SA, which is the one that I joined, Sexaholics Anonymous, and then there's Sex Addicts Anonymous, SAA. Okay, so they have basically two different concepts of what it means to be sober, and SA is the more restrictive. So according to their philosophy, um, no masturbation, no sex outside of a marriage. Even I believe I'm 99% sure that it's not even a committed relationship. It's
Oh,
you're
you
married.
have to be married.
Yeah, you have to be
Okay.
married.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that was very difficult for me as a concept, but at the same time, I was willing to try anything because throughout this time, I was trying to prove to my wife that I could change. I don't think she had a doubt that I could change and try to move forward with her, but I think it was really just the past that she was trying to deal with. So I was just looking. I was just trying to show that I could change, that I could be different, and that's
Sure.
what. So I had that motivation. That was like a fire under me, and I was able to stick to the regimen and do everything I needed to, especially since my wife, she didn't even want to be in the same room as me. So that wasn't much of an issue, but getting in touch with women was not on my radar at that point. I mean, I had deleted it. I had deleted even almost family members because I just didn't want any women in my phone. Like it was a very
Yeah.
intense time in my life.
So take me to, I want to move to even the reconciliation, even though, and what I really feel is tshuva, because I really am fascinated by the notion of a tshuva that does not have a happy ending.
Yeah,
We like and we prefer tshuva stories where it wraps up neatly like a bow, and I find tshuva to be even more remarkable when it doesn't fix everything externally in your life, but you're still engaged with it. But before we get there, just tell me, when did you finally realize and ultimately decide that the marriage is not going to survive
sure,
this?
sure. So after a few months, when my wife started discussing the concept of separation, um, things started unraveling. And we toyed with that concept. I was in denial until it was really a reality for us. And we decided to separate. Again, I didn't want it at all, but we decided to separate. I moved out of the
Sure.
house. We shared custody 50-50. We lived near each other. The kids were going back and forth between our houses. But at this point, there are people who separate, and it means they're definitely getting divorced. And then there are people who separate and it's to work on it. Now, we were from the latter category. We didn't know this was over. I didn't know it was over. And maybe I was lying to myself, but I thought that there was a possibility that we could reconcile. And as time went on, we started, we said, she said, okay, let's maybe get together on a Saturday night. We'll go out for drinks and talk and see if we could, I don't know, start something up again. And I was very excited about these times because I said, okay, this is great, amazing. It's coming. She's going to be able to put this behind her. But every time we got together, she couldn't. She just couldn't move past it. So we were essentially separated, living apart for almost a year. And I'd say about 2 months before that, 10 months into separation was when it was like, okay, there's really nothing to do here. She just will never be able to get beyond this. And that was when we both realized that this was essentially over. And we move forward with it.
You got divorced. Now, it's interesting. I noticed I don't know if I'm noticing correctly. It's hard for you to even say now. Meaning we've spoken about a lot of ugly, unsavory things, and it's interesting to me how even the phrase "we got divorced" is almost, it seems to me, the hardest thing for you to actually articulate. I want to kind of now talk about the aftermath and what does Teshuva. You're still. I'm looking at you. As far as I understand, you're still affiliated with the religious community. You still identify as somebody who's religious.
Yeah.
First, take me through tshuva with the spouse. So much of this is obviously you say, I'm sorry. Obviously you apologize. Obviously you went through the therapies and SA. I'm curious if there was anything else in kind of the way that this unfolded. Do you write a letter of apology? Do you, when this finally unfolded because she was unable to continue with you, is there still was there a concrete effort on your part, aside from trying to save the marriage, outside of that, to actually say I'm sorry, without the, almost to say I'm sorry after the marriage is finished, to say I'm sorry outside of the context of I want to save this, so I'm saying I'm sorry, but I'm sorry now, it's over, and we're not, we're no longer married, and just reflecting and having a moment of being mavakesh mechila and saying, I'm sorry for this. I'm curious how the I'm sorry and the teshuva to a spouse tied into the process, or was it only in the context of saving the marriage?
Well, I would be lying if I said that wasn't a goal of mine throughout. And we had a lot of struggles because I resented her that she was moving away from me. I was like, well, I came clean to you. Everything about what I did.
I'm finally whole.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm here. And you can't forgive me. So there were struggles there. And I resented her, which is wild. But I resented her about a lot of this. But I will say that, and also if you consider the concept of saying sorry after doing something like this, it's almost like you can't say sorry. It's at least that's how it was in the beginning. I can't. How do you apologize? How do you just say sorry for cheating on someone? ruining, like living a double life behind their back for 10 years. It just doesn't cut it. But there did come a point. Yeah, it took a while, but after we were separated, and even once I think I was finally able to say a true sorry, actually, when once I realized we were getting divorced, because that's when I took the ulterior motives off the table. It was like, okay,
Correct.
I ruined her life. This is where we are. I had done, meaning this was a year that was full of difficulty for me, but a lot of growth, because it was the first time I felt, like I was doing real. I looked at myself in the mirror for the first time in 10 years, and I had grown a lot over that year. And
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a moment
yeah,
after.
sure. Sure. So, but I was finally once we took the getting back together off the table. I was finally able to say, like, I took a step back and I said, "Wow, like what I did was, I can learn to forgive myself, but I can't forgive." From her perspective, I can understand if she can't ever forgive me. So I said I need to have some sort of compassion here, and I was finally able to say what I think was, the closest thing to a sorry. I wrote her a long letter. It was actually with someone's help, but just talking about how I had treated her for those years, and also how I had treated her throughout the year of separation, because even that, I wasn't always on my best behavior in terms of our relationship. And I wrote in her, I'd say, a meaningful letter that she appreciated.
In terms of yourself,
Yeah,
and this is really, it's to me the most. It's the most powerful form of tshuva. It reminds me in many ways. I one time listened to I think it was Tzvi Meyer Zilberger. He's a Hasidic Rebbe who used to come to America, once or twice a year, and he had this one. It was back then they had CDs, and I was learning in Shar Yoshev at the time, and my chavrusa, who I love, was a real chassid of his. Like, my chavrusa at that time wore a strimal, he had a beard, and he had me listen to one of these tapes from Rav Tzvi Meyer, and he's not articulate. He doesn't speak English. Like, it's very hard for him to speak English. But he had this. He was talking about anger and losing your temper, and he said the hardest teshuva is after you've lost your temper. You're anyways angry. You already lost it. So, like, how do you do teshuva? How do you regain self control when what you're trying to save has already been lost? And that, to me, is a very powerful part of the story. It's the same way in that apology to your wife, finally able to be real after it's over. I'm curious religiously, what is the effect now? The veneer of being a good guy is more or less, maybe not everybody knows, the details of your struggle, but anybody who knows you obviously knows that you are now divorced, and the good guy, perfect husband, the mask has been lifted off. So much of what motivates us, I think, in a healthy way, in a holy way, religiously, is like to stay within the image, to stay within the box.
yeah,
And I almost imagine for myself, like, if I didn't have the context of community and community images and all that comes with, and not in a cynical way, I'm not cynical of that stuff. Like, it helps you stay motivated. And if all of anyone's ugliness came to the fore, or you're no longer able to save, so to speak, that image, I could imagine that religiously everything would fall apart. So I'm curious how religiously you stay motivated, and what changes have happened following, your life essentially unfolding and falling apart. Like, it fell
yeah,
apart.
absolutely. It fell apart. Again, I don't want to talk about, like, I ruined someone else's life, but I don't want to talk about, I'm talking about from my perspective and everything that happened in my
Correct.
life. It's a phenomenal question, and I'll tell you, David, that essentially what happened was I felt like I was in a shasat chak, like, and not even in a religious way.
A moment of
A moment of
urgency.
urgency. I said, like, I really felt like I had nothing to live especially in the beginning of this. There was like, it was a crisis. It was traumatic. And what I said was, I need to peel away everything that I'm doing for other people, um, and anything I'm doing to try to keep up a certain image. It just, it wasn't that I had to consciously do it. It melted away. Like, I had no, I'll tell you right away that I stopped going to Minyan right away. I went on Shabbos, took my kids to shul, but there was this breakdown where I was going through this crisis. It's very difficult to even describe it, but I said I've been living my life for other people. I used the phrase people pleaser before, and that's something that I've spoken to a lot of people who have gone through similar things, and I just felt like I've been living my entire life for other people and for according to other people's image. And I said, I need to just like break this down and start from scratch. Um, while doing that, throughout this time I still was maintaining a certain level of religiosity. It's also very difficult to describe like how religious. I think one person, if I speak to one person, they might describe me as not religious, maybe, but another person will be like, okay, he's definitely in that camp. I identify myself as being religious throughout this entire time, but like things like I wasn't using a klishlishi for making tea. Things like
Yeah.
that. There was like there was a breakdown.
I'm not even going to bother to translate that for some of our
Oh,
listeners. So if you know, if
if
you know, you
you
know.
know. Like that, I was there, and I'll tell you, there was between me, my relationship with God, everything that has broken down in my life. There's been nothing that I've done to sort of get back, quote unquote, at God, because I don't blame God for anything I've been in. I do resent. I'll tell you, I resent a lot of the community that I grew up in. Not necessarily the house I grew up in, but I think there's a lot of putting on a show for people that I think the concept of failure is really not accepted. I think that we talk about like, oh, failure, failure, failure. When we say failure, it's like, oh, my son didn't wake up for a minion one morning. Okay, but he's going to get back on the horse the next day. It's not like a true dilemma in your life where there's like something that completely broke down. You're faced with real struggles, and I'm very happy to be living in a place where there's much less people looking over their shoulder and trying to fit in. So I felt like I could, I had the I had the freedom to sort of figure everything out for myself,
And
and
start from scratch and
I
rebuild.
I
Meaning,
really
you're not
started from
trying to get
scratch.
back to who you were, pre 10 years
Yeah,
ago, but like, let's build something new.
yeah. I think even the word tshuva, it means to return. The root of the word is to
Yeah,
return. And
sure.
over the years, I always wondered, like, what does it mean? And many speeches I've heard people talk about how it means returning to God. But I think that over this past year, at least in my mind, I think it means real tshuva is returning to who you really are as a person. And it means like not who you want to be, not the show that you're putting on for other people. Scrape away everything. You're alone in a room. Nobody's looking at you. Who are you? Who do you who do you define yourself as? Like what are your qualities? And that's something I learned over this past year. I was someone that I always looked over my shoulder. I was always trying to put on a show for people. And this past year, I've really accepted myself for who I am. And I think by doing that, I I redefined my understanding of who I thought God is. I think a lot of people, we our definition of how we think of God is very largely based on how we grew up and the struggles we've had in our life. Um, even without knowing it. And I never realized that my concept of a God was very vengeful. I would sin, and okay, I'm a sinner, right? Like this
Yeah.
is how it was defined. This was my relationship with God. And over the past few years, I now see God as very understanding. God's very forgiving, accepting, and I think that um, it's not coincidence that it was 10 years of cheating when that God finally said, "Okay, enough." I think the number 10 is like it's one whole unit.
That's
It's like
yeah,
10 years. Okay, 10 years. That's it. Like I'm saving you.
finished.
Like, it's done. You're turning your life around, and I'm putting my hand out for you.
Um, I wonder now. I'm just curious if there's anything you do find particularly religiously nourishing in your life right now. Like what when you start from scratch. I'm curious, like if you've either reawakened or you have like either shards from the past or something new that has given you comfort or that you find particularly nourishing in your religious life.
Yeah, I always loved singing, and I love Jewish music also. So I love I love being in shuls that have beautiful singing. I love being around other people who like singing. I don't think that singing per se is a religious experience, but it's something that really helps me connect. Something I
I'm curious if there's advice, looking back, it's 10 years that you're mired in this, and I'm sure that there are people in whatever way in their own lives. I know this, they've been in my office, I've had conversations with people who are stuck in very real cycles and patterns of ugliness in their own lives, and they're desperate to get out. And very often, particularly with men that I know, they're struggling with issues related to intimacy, with sexuality. Either they're paying for sex, massages, pornography, infidelity, whatever it may be. I'm curious if you have any insight of something that could have been told to you, which is so hard because it was such a guarded secret. It was
yeah.
in the black box. Is there any way out of this aside from the pain and all of the suffering that comes with actual disclosure and full honesty? Was there ever a way that this ship could have been turned around, or whether it was therapy or SA? Is there anything that you could have done earlier, or telling somebody, maybe even a listener who's struggling with this before everything, hits the fan and the chaos and the tohu vavohu that predates creation enters into somebody's life? I'm curious if there's anything that you think you could have told yourself or told somebody else before this had happened.
Yeah, well, if you're talking about going back all those years before anything happened with a woman, or even I don't know, are you asking about even before pornography and
I'm
masturbation?
asking about the infidelity. I'm not saying,
So
could avoiding any slip ups over the duration of your life,
yeah,
but something that could help somebody who is not being faithful in their marriage.
yeah. Well,
How do you get out of this earlier?
hindsight is 2020, so I can't say that if I that if we go back all those years, if I you know if someone was there for me, things would have been different. But I think that um, just even finding someone to disclose this information to, like if you can find someone to be honest with, who can just at first even just listen to you, I think, at least for myself, that would have helped me be honest with myself, because the entire time I felt like I was just lying. I was just rolling. There was no looking at myself in
Yeah.
the mirror. If you could even get a slight sense of being able to look at yourself in the mirror, say that what you're doing is just not okay, but not just that it's not okay, like you're a sinner, like it's not okay. You need to be a healthier person for yourself. Like you're going through something that's very difficult, and you're struggling with something. I think you spoke about people who have sat with you and told you. I think that's a great first step. I mean, I wish that I felt comfortable with someone way back when. I think that that might have helped me a lot.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's kind of, we usually think of chavrusas to learn Gemara, to study Chumash, to learn a Torah text together. And I think that, chavrusas for life. One friend, somebody who you trust deeply, who you can be radically honest with. And I was actually, for me, it's so interesting. I had a close friend who came out to me. He came out of the closet
I think you might have mentioned this
very
on one of your
early.
podcasts.
Yeah, nobody else knew at the time. I think maybe one other person, but nobody who he was in touch with knew. And he was so radically honest with me, it actually opened up my heart, and I'm like, oh, I finally have a friend who I know and I can trust 100,000% to be like deeply honest with. And like, it's so easy, to get caught to alienate you from yourself when you build this room of lies, and it's this like small room with no windows,
Yeah.
and you just have all your ugliness hidden away. And even one friend who you can be radically honest with, even one friend who you can really talk about what's going on, holistically in your life, I think is phenomenal advice, and really a path forward for this. I can't thank you enough for sharing this. You're not sharing this for your own clout or reputation. This is completely anonymous, and we're really trying to change any identifying characteristics. I'm toying. There's a seriousness to this conversation, so I'm hesitant to close the interview
Rapid fire?
in our rapid fire typical way. But if you'll allow me, I'm most concerned and really genuinely want to know more about the first question, which is, are there any books that opened up your eyes? Not everybody is a reader through a learner through reading, but I am curious if for you in this process there were any books that opened up your eyes and gave insight into your struggles, into the nature of infidelity, the nature of marriage, that you found impactful and insightful in your life.
Yeah, so I'm really trying to focus. There's a lot of things that I've read over the years, but I'm trying to focus on that initial stage of I'm speaking to the person who is going through something and is not being honest about it. I think that if I'm speaking to that person, I'd recommend picking up literature from SA meetings. Like there's the White Book. There's even you can read like alcohol AA literature. I think that someone who's going through those stages, it's like very very important to read about people who have gone through similar things and realize that you're not alone in this. But beyond that, I think I would recommend a few other things. There's a book called Attached. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I have.
It's about attachment styles and how we are in relationships, and I think that helped me gain a lot
Do you
of
remember
insight.
who wrote it?
Yeah, I actually have it in front of me. Dr. Amir Levine and Rachel Heller.
That is a great recommendation. I appreciate it. Again, the book is called
It's called
Attached.
Attached. Period. And it's about our attachment styles that we learn from a very young age. I think it's great. And then something else that helped me a lot is a book by John Kim called Single on Purpose. It's called
Huh.
Single on Purpose. It's something that helped me a lot as someone who was always in some sort of relationship from the time I started talking to girls. I had this time where I could not, if I wanted to prove when I thought that we were going to get back together, I thought there might be some sort of chance. I was really trying to be on my best behavior. So I picked up this book. It was a really big help for me. So
I appreciate that. Really, those recommendations: Single on Purpose, Attached, and of course the literature from SA, which is really, really important. Those are three great recommendations. My
I
next
would
question,
also, I
yeah.
also would say that I also want to mention that I created an email address in case people wanted to get in touch with me, because maybe
Oh,
hearing that I'm in, you know, maybe even though finding a friend, that might be a struggle for some people. So I want people to know that if they want to get in touch
please.
with someone, the name of the email address is 10 years of cheating, 10 the number 10, 10 years of cheating at
At wow, 10
gmail.com.
years of cheating at
Gmail.com.
gmail.com. That is that's a heavy email address and a heavy story. I'm always curious, if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical with no responsibilities whatsoever to go back to school and get a PhD. What do you think the subject and title of your dissertation would be?
I don't have, I can give you the subject, but I would love to study infidelity in the religious community. Because, as you know, when you open up to someone, a lot of people open up to you. And I've heard so many stories over the years of things that are going on, men, women, husbands, wives. Like, it's just, there's a lot of stuff going on in the religious community, and I think it needs to be addressed. Um, at least looked into, studied. So I would love to have
That would
something to
be
do with it.
important and holy work. I too, you have people who you grew up with or you knew, and people get caught in these things, and it is deeply painful, and it's an important subject because if it's left unexamined, it can only metastasize and snowball. My final question, I'm always curious, and you mentioned a little bit already. I don't know if it's changed. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
Yeah, I'm an early bird. I go to sleep at about between 10:30 and 11, and I wake up at anywhere between 5:15 and 5:45.
Hello. Uh, that is early in the morning, way out of my range.
Well, something that has helped
But
me a
for
lot for over the past few years has been exercise. Really, really, it has helped me help. It has helped my mind a lot. So I wake up early. I run. I cycle. I just do whatever I can to get my body moving.
I cannot thank you enough for your honesty, and your authenticity and sharing a story that I know was so painful to you and so painful to so many others. But you sharing, I cannot thank you enough for speaking with me today.
Thank you, David.
There are so many things that touch me and move me in this interview. This person is not doing it for self-aggrandizement. They remain completely anonymous. But the part that I think moved me most is the notion of teshuva after everything falls apart, the notion of trying to make amends after everything has been broken. Very often, what motivates our amends and teshuva is the faint hope that we can restore that perceived perfection that we once had. We can make everything better again. We can make everything perfect again. And once something completely falls apart, a marriage, a family is broken apart, and all of the devastating effects of infidelity, I understand the reaction of like, well, now making amends doesn't even make sense. Now it's too late. Now there's no point. There's no purpose. Everything has already been broken. And this is something that, as I mentioned in the interview, like is near and dear to my heart. I remember, and I forgot his name. I think I mentioned it in the interview. I spent a summer learning in Shar Yashuv with somebody named Reb David Stein. I'm 99% sure I'm getting his name correct. Who was a very special person, a really devout Hasidish. He was my age, but he became Hasidish like midway through life. A very special person, and he shared a tape recording with me of the person who he considered his Rebbe, who's someone named Rav Tzvi Meyer Zilberg, who is the grandson of Rav Gedalia Shor, who was a Rosh Hashiva in Torah V'das. To talk about that family a different time. He happens to also be cousins with a Rebbe in Ner Yisrael named Rav Tzvi Einstadter. He's a very special person. And I remember it was a tape about anger. And he said, the hardest time to do tshuva is after you get angry. The hardest time to do tshuva, because you anyways got angry. You anyways lost your temper. You anyways lost your cool. So it's easy I'll do tshuva. My hope is that, so I'll never get angry. I'll never mess up again. And then once you mess up, you're like, okay, next time we'll try to be perfect. And then you don't think that, how do I do tshuva with the brokenness in front of me? How do I do tshuva after I've literally transgressed? The way I put it, and it's loosely based on the Kutzker, but I don't want to blame him for this, is that very often in the process of tshuva, we try to do better mitzvos, more positive commandments, daven better, more Torah study, keep Shabbos better. Everything should be better and like on the way to perfection. And what I heard from this interview is, what does it mean to do better averos? That sometimes it's not just about doing better mitzvos, but sometimes it's about doing better averos, that we transgress in a better way. What used to knock you out in 30 seconds, in a minute, in 10 minutes, now takes half an hour, takes an hour. You used to lose your temper at the drop of a hat, and now it takes a little bit more. You still lose your temper. You still mess up. You still fall apart. You still make mistakes. But figuring out the role of teshuva after transgression, not to retain a model of perfection. It's an idea that I've spoken about before, and I've spoken about it on this very podcast, an idea that I heard from my dearest friend. I've quoted it before, but I always come back to it. My dearest friend, Rav Simcha Willig, who showed me really something remarkable from somebody named Rabbi Rob Scheinberg, who I believe is a conservative rabbi in, I think in Queens, but I could be wrong. But my friend, Rav Simcha Willig, shared with me this Torah that has, I legitimately found it transformative. It's on the verse in the 5th chapter of Lamentations in Eicha. It's almost how we conclude all of Eicha, and Eicha has a very dear place in my heart. It's all about exile, but we say it many times throughout the high holidays, and that's the verse, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha, God, return to us, V'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, renew our days as of old. Which, if you pay close attention, renew our days as of old. Which one is it? Should they be new or should they be old? So the Medrash actually has an interpretation that when we pray for Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, to renew our days as of old, that Kedem is referring to Gan Eden. It's referring to the Garden of Eden, which is referred to as Kedem. But when the Medrash points out that Kedem is referred to as Gan Eden, it actually skips over the first reference and the first time where the term Kedem is used to describe the Garden of Eden. And instead, it jumps to the second time that the word Kedem is used in reference to the Garden of Eden, and that is in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, the 24th verse. And over there, it has a very different context. It's not in the first time that it's mentioned, God just calls Gan Eden, calls the Garden of Eden Kedem, and says you could have the Midrash could have used that opportunity to say, hey, and we see over here that Kedem refers to Gan Eden. It doesn't refer to the first time that it's mentioned. It actually refers to the second time that it's mentioned, and that is in the 24th verse of the 3rd chapter of Bereshis, of Genesis, where it says, Vayigaresh es ha'adam vayashkein mikedem legan Eden, that Adam was driven out of Gan Eden and he lived east of the Garden of Eden, which really gives a new context to what we are praying for when we say Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. It does not mean renew our lives as they were in the Garden of Eden. Rather, it means renew our lives as you renewed our lives after we were exiled from the Garden of Eden. And if you pay close attention to the verse, Vayigaresh literally means to be divorced, after exile, after everything falls apart. And in that sense, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem is then not a plea for restoration of a formerly perfect condition, but rather it's a plea for resilience, a plea for the ability to renew ourselves after future crises and dislocations, after divorce, after exile, after life has been broken into a million pieces, but to give us that strength and resilience just as our lives have been renewed before. And that's something that I took away from this interview. Aside from the implications about actual infidelity, but in that larger, more general sense, the notion of teshuva, the notion of reacclimating and rediscovering your relationship to Yiddishkeit, to relationships themselves, even following a vayagarish, even following a divorce, in every sense of the word, a religious divorce, a spousal divorce, when our lives feel like they're in a million pieces. But I don't want to end there because this topic is so sensitive and because it is so important. I thought it was really crucial to include a second conversation, and that is with somebody who is really an expert in this specific field, namely infidelity. I have a very dear friend, somebody who, calling him a friend is not enough. This is somebody who is a fighter on behalf of the Jewish people. He is lochem. He fights. He battles for Avas Yisrael, for the love of every Jew. I don't want to say who he is. He knows who he is. And to the outsiders, this person, everybody, he's a kibitzer, he's a jokester, he's all those things. But in his heart of hearts, this is somebody who makes room for the entirety of the Jewish people. And it's somebody who I knew would know. I called him up and I said, look, we want to cover infidelity on 1840. I need the very best. I need somebody. And he asked me right away, before the fact, I said, I want to talk about what really happens, what really goes on. And this person did not hesitate. He knew exactly who it was. It was actually a moving story. He said he has given his credit card to this therapist to help other people get therapy and piece their lives back together. This is what kind of person this person is. And the name that he mentioned immediately is Dr. Malika Bhowmik. Dr. Malika Bhowmik literally wrote her PhD on infidelity. It's called A Grounded Theory Investigation of the Subjective Responses from Partners and Couples Where Infidelity Has Occurred. And it's a qualitative study where she interviewed actual patients who are going through, in the context of their marriage, issues of infidelity. I just wanted to be clear. I personally don't think it matters. She is not Jewish. Her mentor, Esther Perel, is internationally renowned. She has worked very closely with Esther Perel and mentions her a few times in the conversation. And more importantly, I read her dissertation. I would actually encourage others to read the dissertation because it tells you so much about marriage and what makes it strong and what makes it weak and the pressure points. But in the dissertation, she does have an Orthodox Jewish couple. And you really see in that dissertation, when you read it, there's so much that is universal, even for people who, thank God, have not struggled with this overtly, but maybe in the sense of Jimmy Carter, committed infidelity in their hearts on whatever level. It's really an incredible work. It's readable. I read the whole thing. It's 180 pages. It's written in very plainly, but it's interesting. There's a lot of quotes from the couples, what they were feeling, what they were going through. And it was one of those conversations where in the middle of the conversation, I had this overwhelming sense of confidence that I am speaking to the right person. I am speaking to the expert in this field, somebody who really understands what goes on. And most importantly, somebody who really universalized the struggle of ensuring that we have the level of commitment to our marriages as we grow up in life and go through life, who really knows how to reinforce the work, the love, the care, commitment, loyalty that marriage asks of us. I had an incredible sense of confidence while speaking to her, which is why it is my absolute privilege and pleasure. I'm so grateful that she took the time. I left a message on her phone. It was like a few weeks ago. She's very busy. It took her a week, but she returned my call and immediately said, okay, let's do this. This is important work. It is my absolute privilege to introduce our conversation with Dr. Malika Bhowmik. It really is a privilege to speak with you. I got your number from somebody who I trust really, really deeply in this area.
Great.
And you literally wrote your PhD on infidelity. You wrote a PhD entitled A Grounded Theory Investigation of the Subjective Responses from Partners and Couples Where Infidelity Has Occurred. And
Mhm.
it's a qualitative study where you interviewed couples and how they go through the entire process from before the affair through discovery and the potential and the possibility of reconciliation. I wanted to begin with a very basic question. I think all people have lust, they have desires that may not be met at points in a marriage. There's definitely issues of people within the context of a marriage. Maybe they're looking at pornography, maybe they're going to massage parlors or a strip club, or things where their spouse would not approve of it. Yet it is something different about infidelity, about being in a relationship, so to speak. Let's focus on that for a moment. And I'm wondering, why is it that some people's desires lead to actual infidelity? They're in a relationship with somebody who their spouse doesn't know, and it escalates past the point of just almost like fulfilling a specific sexual desire. What are the factors that lead to infidelity in the deeper emotional sense in the context of a relationship, beyond acting on desires that should not should be fulfilled, I guess, in an ideal world in the context of a marriage?
Okay. So what are the factors? That's the core question. What are the
Yeah.
factors that lead to an infidelity?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's kind of be broad about it, right? Because the fact is they're so idiosyncratic and subjective and personal. Um, so you'd really have to ask each person. But to try to kind of distill something, um, there it's not uncommon for somebody who is engaged in an affair or even sort of considering it to be blown away by themselves, right? They never ever thought they would. They married their spouse with every intention of keeping, upholding monogamy and remaining faithful. They would maybe even be judgmental of people who've had affairs in the past. So it's that feasible for someone who never ever thinks they would, to some, under the right circumstances, suddenly be more receptive. And so if we're trying to be clear about what are those circumstances, it'll, in broad strokes, and I'll also preface something here for a moment and say, if I'm talking about, often I'll be referring to married couples and the sort of traditional gendered breakdowns and sexual orientation breakdowns. I mean, that's not representative of all relationships and all people
Sure.
and all gender identities, right? And sexual orientations. And so in general, I'm going to even be, before I break it down to male, female, infidelity can happen in some instances, not because there's necessarily something that's sort of not good in the marriage, but because there's something not good in the self. There's something that feels unresolved or listless in the self. And there are certain things that might bring that to a head. Like if there's a person that somebody encounters that makes the individual who then ultimately has the affair feel a certain way that they haven't felt in a long time. So in a stereotypical breakdown, it's often the case where the husband in a standard sort of, kind of like the in a marriage where there's a husband and a wife, and this is a sort of traditional arrangement, can often feel like he's failing his wife, like there's a deep sense of inadequacy, like he's not maybe earning enough money, or he's not, is not what she expected for him to be, or her parents maybe expected for him to be, or what he wants to be in the eyes of his children. And so someone like that might be more vulnerable to an affair, because in that affair world, in the bubble of being with another person, there isn't that sense of letting people down in the same way. There isn't that sense of disappointing others. And there's a sense of adequacy and feeling better about oneself, and, able to sort of access an old feeling of being more okay with themselves or not disappointing anybody, and just feeling like there's a sense of like being able to connect with a part of themselves that they struggle to feel in their day-to-day lives. And that's exactly the same for women, wives. Like they may really feel like they are, they don't, it's rarely the case that people don't love their spouse or love their families. It's rarely the case that they don't want that marriage. That's rarely the case. It's far more often the case that they are, let's say it's a wife now, right? She's drawn to a sort of autonomy maybe that she can feel when she's around. And so, I'm thinking of examples of folks who have encountered people in work environments, women who have been in jobs and suddenly found themselves attracted to somebody in ways that they never imagined that they would. Just in settings where people congregate, right? Where suddenly you find a spark, you feel that feeling, and there's something, I think it's not uncommon for women to feel that the same exact thing I'm saying, like a sense of like, for women, I think it has to do with autonomy and independence, because once you become wife and then you become mother, there's a sense of deep obligation to this group of people, who you owe so much of yourself to. You feel that way anyway. So to reconnect with a sense of independence and a sense of freedom that you can experience again in the bubble of an affair, that can be very compelling and very, very seductive. And what can often happen on both sides, male, female, right? Whomever it is, let's call it the sort of like, a person who's having the affair, the actor or the agent in the affair will start to make justifications around why it's not so bad, because actually I'm not so happy with my partner, and it's because but it's rarely that they are conscious of those things and seek out an affair, sort of as a sort of step two, right? It's really more that they're plodding along in their lives and there may be some issues, but all in all, they have they're not looking for an affair, but then discovering one, or that sort of chemistry that exists among us all, you might be more vulnerable to it or more susceptible to it or more kind of able to be pulled into it if you can kind of quickly and readily start kind of saying, well, the combination of being able to quickly start kind of changing the narrative in your mind and saying, well, my partner doesn't really do this or that, or this really does bother me, and this other person doesn't do those things. And so that's somehow we start to do a little bit of justifying around why we're doing what we're doing or how we feel entitled to doing what we're doing. Plus what I said a moment ago about feeling like you really just want to remember a version of yourself or experience a new version of yourself that you're not able to access in the marriage that you're in, right? When we pick a partner, we're sort of, that's the story that we're living in. And we are not getting the experience of knowing what it would be like to be with someone else, right? Or to be alone again. And so we know we're making that sacrifice, but then when something tempts us to kind of remember that feeling, of more independence or a different partner, et cetera, sometimes we cannot resist it. It's really that.
It's incredibly profound the way that you framed it. It happens to be that I am enamored with the notion of unlived lives, the alternative self. When we make commitments, we have these dreams of what we could have been, what we could have become, all the options that we discarded. I'm wondering if in the pre-affair, the way you're framing it, and I know you're speaking very broadly, it's hard, we're narrowing it down to a traditional family structure. Most of our audience falls within, broadly speaking, at least those who are married.
Right.
But I'm wondering if before the affair, there's so much secrecy, so much of the seduction of an affair is the secrecy, is this bubble that you're able to create and kind of live out this unlived life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, number one, what could be done at that stage to prevent an affair? What can be done in that, I'm talking, coming not only from my deep sanctity of marriage itself, and obviously the prohibitions that exist in the Jewish world, but the prohibitions, unfortunately, very often don't stop people who are stuck in this.
Mm-hmm.
And you're developing an emotional connection. I think very often, I don't know if there are statistics, but I think the workplace can be a very dangerous ground for people. We're in the workplace, and I'm wondering, what would you tell someone who feels that, like, that pull, that draw of that unlived self, that life that they're, they're a dad at home, they're a mom at home, and all of a sudden at work they get to be somebody else in someone else's eyes? What can be done to save the commitment of marriage at that point? And do people even come in at that stage, or it's so secret, that's really what's drawing them, that rarely are people coming in before it happens? They're usually only walking in after their lives are turned upside down.
Yes, and I would just add to that, and rarely are couples talking about the possibility of this before they're ever tempted by a moment like this one. The reality is we're just human, all of us, and we're going to respond to certain other humans. That thing about chemistry doesn't stop once we're married, but we don't really dialogue those moments through with our spouse even after we are married, right? Or up until marriage, right? We don't tend to sit down and say, so what are we going to do when you find yourself attracted to someone else, or I find myself attracted? Like, what's our plan of action, or how do we do? What's our unique, couple arrangement around that? Because each couple that can do this, in their own way, and so long as they're at peace with what's going on within their marriage, then that's the most important thing.
Well, if I could jump in, I'm talking specifically, I guess, in the, let's assume that in this couple, for, religious reasons or whatever reasons, there's no possibility that it would be okay, like, oh sure, have a dalliance or something like that. Let's assume, in the context that we're discussing, that no couple would be, oh, we'll have an open marriage, which I know so. How can it be addressed in a healthy way?
Sure. But I think there's even, sort of thinner slices there. Like, can we talk about the reality that at some point you will be attracted to someone else and I will be attracted to someone else? And can we make space for that? Can we be understanding around that? Is that something we can tolerate so that's many steps before an affair or any opening of any marriage, right? That's just acknowledging the humanity of each person and the fallacy or the vulnerability or the reality of how the human heart and mind work without transgressing, right? Without crossing a line. None of these couples, I mean, I shouldn't say none, but it's rare that couples have even that level of conversation, about, like, before I met you and before I committed myself entirely to you, I was whatever, dating, or I was more receptive, to the opposite sex. And I was more, and I liked that feeling. And so how are we going to navigate when those moments present themselves? And it's rarely the case when it's in that sort of honeymoon newlywed phase, right? It's really when things get harder and marriage becomes work, which it very much is, as much work as it is pleasure. So I think I'm sort of answering your question a little bit already by just getting at, like, if it were more our sort of societal cultural norm to acknowledge that we have not yet fully committed ourselves to any one person for life until marriage, right? So we're having to learn a new ability here, basically, and say, okay, now I'm monogamous till death, right? Now that's my prerogative. That's what I want more than I want what I had before. So, and that's sort of, I think, an important way of putting it, because it's not like you have no interest in other people or you're not drawn in on occasion, but you want the thing that you want the most is to remain, monogamous or faithful, or, and here are the pieces that I'll add, that you'll want to be in deep, open communication with your spouse about these moments when they present themselves, ideally before they present themselves. But to respond to another part of your question, no, couples almost never come in to kind of get ahead of this sort of thing. They come in when things are hitting the fan, right? They come in a state of crisis, and they cannot believe, the partner who's on the receiving end of the affair is just absolutely just floored that their partner was able to have an affair. They never saw that coming. They are completely beside themselves. And the partner who had the affair is in reality navigating two feelings. The two things that they're feeling is all that agony at having hurt their spouse who they love, and they don't want to lose that marriage, and they certainly don't want the reputation of as a person who's had an affair, et cetera, in their community. And then the other thing that goes more underground, but is very much alive inside of somebody who had an affair, is often alive inside of someone who had an affair, is the mourning of the lover, basically, of the third person who entered the picture and made them feel a way that they haven't felt in a really long time. It's sometimes the case that a person having an affair says, works up the courage, essentially, right? And then builds up the sort of wherewithal to say, this has to stop. I need to end this. I cannot continue this. It's just as common, I think, unfortunately, more common that they get discovered, right? So that is a different animal. It hurts either way for the person on the receiving end of this affair, and it hurts either way for the person who's doing the ending of an affair, but it hurts differently. In the latter scenario where you've been outed and discovered, now you're just reeling from, you had zero control over sort of any aspect of it, the person who had the affair. So, and I couldn't tell you how often one happens or the other, meaning how often someone deliberately, intentionally says, this has to stop. I can't keep doing this. I'm married. Maybe you're married too. We have families. Let's amicably part and say, we got to stop doing this. But my sense is that it's more often that once you're that far down that road, you've kind of lost your bearings in a way, as it is, right? So it's not so uncommon for someone to then just be discovered, basically, at that point, because I think people do have a sense of being so far, off the beaten path, right? So far away from themselves that it's hard to kind of redirect it and get back on track.
Let's talk for a moment, and I love the way that you framed it. Everyone, has had periods in their life where they were not yet married. And the question of, you want to be monogamous, you want to be married more than that previous state. Not that that previous state ceases to exist, but
Exactly.
you want to be married more. And I think for a lot of couples, even following the discovery, and let's talk about, again, we're talking about this narrow subsect now where there was a discovery, it wasn't broken off, and they still kind of in their heart of hearts want to be married more, maybe for cultural reasons. We're within the Jewish community, marriage is a very integral part. I know in your dissertation you talk specifically and highlight, you have Orthodox Jewish couples that you mention in your dissertation. Obviously without identifying markers, you don't say who they
Exactly.
are, obviously.
Right.
So don't look it up for that reason. But what I am curious about is, a lot of times both people do want to be married more than break apart. But even when you have that feeling, not all marriages survive the discovery of an affair. Not all marriages survive the knowledge that someone has been unfaithful. And I want to know about the process of healing, because I know some people, and we're talking about it in this episode, who their marriage fell apart. And I do know some people who were able to stay together. And I'm curious if there are any broad stroke themes. What allows a marriage to reconcile following a affair, and what causes the marriage to ultimately dissolve? Is it a matter of who wanted it more? I wanted marriage much more. That I'm talking about people who they do want to be married. They didn't want an affair. They didn't go into marriage saying, I plan on cheating you. I plan on committing
Sure.
adultery.
Mhm.
So I want to know, what are, broadly speaking, the themes that allow some marriages to have the resilience to survive and other marriages collapse?
Okay. So there's such a, it so depends on the relationship between the two people that, sort of, that we're talking about, right? It has everything to do not just with one person or the other person, but the coming together of those two people. Because there could be one person that deeply, deeply wants to solve it, and then the other is in too much pain or simply cannot. And I don't just mean the person who was cheated on. You know what I mean? I think sometimes people on the agent in the infidelity, it's not uncommon where, let me put it this way: the person receiving the affair, on the receiving end of the affair, is kind of just all torn up from the discovery, but then quickly says, I don't want you to have an affair. I want you and me together. I want to work on this. I want everything to be better. Maybe we can figure it out from here. And the person who had the affair says, I've learned something about myself that I cannot unlearn, and this marriage cannot continue. That's for sure existed, just as in my experience, just as frequently as the person that says, you cheated on me, I cannot trust you, this has to end. So it works both ways. We're essentially talking about the level of motivation to try that all partners need to have in the room to be able to take a first step. Each person has to be sincerely willing to learn something from this, instead of just sort of decide that this is the data point that they needed to not be in this marriage anymore, right? That this was sufficient evidence that this is irretrievable, this is broken beyond repair. It demands that two people are motivated to go deeper than that, basically learn more than that, understand this instead of just be in pain about this, like make some meaning out of what's happened here. So if you've got two people in the room, even if they're in tremendous pain, one or both of them, usually it's both of them, even if they're in pain, if they have a desire to more deeply understand and make sense of it. How did you do that? And what was my inadvertent contribution? And what was our marriage before this was able to happen? What happened next? What was it that you were, a mentor of mine, Esther Perel, has a sort of shorthand here for this, which is what this meant for me and what this did for you. And what that means is, like, let's say the person who's had the affair might say, this is what this meant for me. This meant for me, let's say it's a woman, that I didn't have to be a mother, that I didn't have to take care of anybody, that I wasn't responsible to parent or to provide. So I was utterly clear that what was happening was something I wanted, not something I am obliged, to do in this world. It was something that I could be absolutely certain was something that was only for me. And that's what this did for me. This is what this offered me. This is what I got there that I wasn't getting here. This is what kept bringing me back to it. That same person would need to hold the other pole of it, which is what this did for you, right? Or what this did to you, which is, even though this did something for me that felt positive, I'm observing and I'm sitting with and I'm present for and I'm feeling what this did to you, which is destroy your sense of trust, right? Break your heart, upend our marriage as we know it, hurt you, in the moment it feels irreparably, right? Hurt you beyond repair. And that's the line that a person who's the kind of actor in the affair would need to walk, a sort of wanting to bring in a very deeply authentic way to their spouse what it was that they were getting out of that affair, in order for that spouse to have really to understand very deeply what it actually was, not what they think it was. Because that part, let's say I'm talking about a woman, right? So I was just using a woman, a wife example. A husband over here might think, it's me, it's because I don't make enough money, it's because I'm not as handsome as I once was, or I'm not doing this or that for her, and fills in the blanks with something, personalizes this, right? It's my failing that resulted in your infidelity. And the value of these conversations is that this husband can discover how little that actually had to do with her interest in an affair. She may really say, I never stopped loving you. I never stopped, wanting this marriage with you, or wanting our family, wanting our community. This is really important to me. The things I was getting there are not correlated to you, how much money you're making, you know what I'm saying? Or any of the sort of insecurities that may come up over here, in a kind of traditional arrangement on the man's side, about, that person's body, or that person's wealth, or that person's, what they have that I don't have. And that's sort of a personalization of all this. And, in a way, a sort of way of imagining that you had some control over it all. But at the end of the day, this wife partner was drawn to the affair simply because she could feel untethered from her life, that the life that she's, committed to day in and day out, that she genuinely wants, right? But that she also wanted some freedom from it, or an opportunity to escape it. And so she's got to sort of walk that line, speak to both parts, and then he over here would need to be interested enough in like, what were you getting out of that affair? You know, to be able to, I mean, so this has to be done sort of, you know, with respect to what stage the couple is in terms of working on these things. Like when they first come in, it's not uncommon for the person who was blindsided by an affair to need all the focus of the work. That person really needs our undivided attention. That person's life as they know it was just completely, the rug of life is pulled out from under them. So that's usually a big part of it, is just grounding this couple that's currently in crisis around like, this is what happened. You never saw this happening. You're in free fall. And the person who had the affair to just bear witness to all that hurt. If they love their partner, they'll want that, right? If they want this marriage, they'll want to hang in there. They'll want to. It's so important that they bear witness to the heartache of their spouse whom they betrayed, and feel something, because it's one thing to imagine your affair being discovered, and it's a very different thing to live your affair being discovered and live watching your partner's pain on their face, you know, and tolerate that or experience reactions to that. When it's in the bubble, you're just not feeling the same way about that. So I want to really stay close to your question, because I could say very, very many things, but what makes the difference in terms of the couples that make it, essentially, right, and the couples that ultimately decide that it doesn't work, you know, key piece here is a curiosity about, how did this happen truly, right? Like we're hurting, but we want this marriage. So can we be motivated to learn more, dig deeper, make more sense of this? Maybe that will help. And I would say, as a clinical psychologist and a couples therapist and a person who's with an expertise in infidelity, that yes, that is exactly what starts to take the pain away, is a deeper understanding of, because you love your partner and you didn't know your partner was feeling so trapped. And it's not you that trapped her or him, them. It was like the sort of pressures of all of it, you know, the sort of like institution of marriage, maybe the institutions of parenthood, the, you know, the sort of societal expectations placed on people who are married. You know, it's rarely just like, were not enough for me, and hence I've had this affair. And when you hear about your partner's, you know, or let's say it's a man that had the affair, if a wife is listening deeply and with curiosity and motivated to work on this and resolve some of what hurts here, if she's really loves this guy and wants to fight for this marriage, then she'll make room for his authentic reasons how he got pulled into this affair. Like, I felt more capable there with this woman. I felt like I could impress her, but I can't impress you. I felt like I was earning enough to really, blow this person away, but not blow you away. I felt more solid in myself. I felt better about myself. I haven't felt good about myself here with you. And that's not your fault per se. That's just the standard I hold myself to when I'm in your presence. That's something I create in my mind in your presence that I don't create in my mind in the presence of this other person. And now we're doing the work. Now, if you've got an engaged wife, she'll say, where'd you get that idea that I want you to make this much money? Or I want your body to be this way, or I want your, energy to be here. Or I want you to be doing this or that, or, and then we're starting to have, this is the core, change agent, conversations like never before, talking on a deeper level to one another that did not exist pre-infidelity. There's a sort of deep reckoning around, okay, where am I and where are you and how have we been feeling? And what have you been telling yourself that I want? And what have I been telling myself that you want, or that our family wants, or that's expected of us? That tends to just kind of get glossed over in the day-to-day rhythms. But it's so vitally important. And this is also my easier said than done, but what I'd prescribe to get ahead of an affair is this level of deep communication around starting to resent you for this, or I'm starting to feel stressed by that, or I feel like I'm doing too much of this work. I want you to pick up this slack, or I'm unhappy. I feel like you're not hearing me on this thing that matters to me. These are the things that plant the seeds for an infidelity, right? But we rarely kind of shine a light on them and nip them in the bud. Unfortunately, if there ends up being an infidelity, it's because these things didn't get resolved, in that sort
And
of
they festered.
infancy. And they fester
Yes.
and they grow, and but
Yeah.
most of it really in an unconscious manner. Because if you ask that woman, a month before she has that affair, or that man a month before he has that affair, are you ever going to cheat on your spouse? They'll say, absolutely not. Things are imperfect. We have, stress, et cetera. But like, I would never. So it's that kind of the stars align in that way where somehow all of a sudden someone is. But yes, there's a festering that we are conscious of, but we're not conscious of how that makes us vulnerable to someone else. We might say things are not great here, but of course I'm never going to cheat, and of course I don't not want this marriage, and of course, we're fine. We're just like any other couple that's going through a rocky patch.
I'm very conscious of your time. I have two more questions if time allows.
Time does allow today. Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
I have one question, and this may be too specific and maybe outside your expertise, but I don't think it's outside of your expertise, but it's maybe outside of like the specifics of what we're talking about. But I've had this experience many times where people come to my office to speak to me, and they had a something. They either went to a place they weren't supposed to go to. It could be a strip club, it could be a massage parlor, or they looked at pornography, things that in the context of a marriage the other spouse would absolutely frown upon. And without, or they had an emotional affair, an actual affair, and they broke it off. They stopped. And they come and they ask the following question: should I tell my spouse? I am living with a great amount of guilt right now.
Mhm.
Should I come totally clean, or is it kind of my responsibility to bear the brunt of the guilt because this was my action? I'm sure there are so many different variables
Yeah.
that go into how you counsel somebody to disclose. There was no discovery. It's over. They're not going anymore. How do you frame the decision of that radical disclosure that is going to place a great deal of pressure on the marriage? Should a spouse come forward and be communicative about these failings, these, whatever you want to call them, these ruptures in the marriage? Or is it better to just work individually, deal with your guilt, and like, let's work one-on-one to strategize how it's not going to happen again?
Yeah, it's so nuanced, right? It's easy to phrase it like should they, yes or no, but there's so much context to something like that. Like who is this person and what do they do, and what's who is their partner, and what would that mean to that unique partner? So, actually, let me say one thing quickly that I'm thinking about that I didn't add to our last question, and was my dissertation finding, which I think is pertinent to it. Just came to me here. Let me say this now before I lose it again. The other thing that makes a couple really last, ultimately, the thing that really is one of the sort of key pieces to healing from an infidelity, right? And moving through the pain, having that depth of conversation, understanding each other more deeply, is often that the person who had the affair becomes ultimately they're in a position to really know what is it that I get out of my marriage that I don't get out of my affair, and that I don't get out of anything else anywhere in the world. And they shine a light in my um, in my case in their couples therapy session on what makes their partner, their spouse, singularly right for them more than anyone else on the planet, right? There's always going to be chemistry or attraction maybe to other people, but what makes that person that they are married to, what does that person have, or what is that unique relationship that the two of them make together that that person could not make with anyone else in the world? That's the thing that often offers the person who's on the receiving end of an affair a kind of reassurance that, oh wow, he went and had this affair and he discovered some things he deeply values about me and our marriage in a way that he hadn't been as conscious of beforehand. And same with women, and right, she's discovered something about me, something about what we have together that's really precious to her, that she is conscious of what she's risking in a way that she wasn't before. And I'm getting a sense of just what I represent to her what I and I alone have to offer her or him, them, that no one else has to offer. And that reassures me that we are very unlikely to have another affair, that I am incredibly important and special and singular to this person, and our relationship is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Uh, and that safeguards us differently from another infidelity, and my fears about infidelity. Um, I have a sense of my deep importance to this other person, and that really helps couples mend deeply and be very on very different footing, at the end of it all, basically at the end of all that, crisis and upheaval. Okay, so that was one essential element to how the couples that truly trudge through and make it to the other side versus the ones that just they're not invested enough in deeper meaning making, and they're in too much pain, and they simply have a wall up that cannot be penetrated. So now let me respond quickly to this other one that you're asking, the question of should someone disclose or not disclose, basically, right? So my first thought here is I have seen all too many people who say, I'll never do that again. You know what? I've done this once, but you know what? It's out of my system. I'll never do it again. That's it. I'm done. I'm all good. I feel bad about it. I'll never do it again.
Yeah.
And I wish it worked. I really do, because that would be ideal and convenient. Maybe for some it does, but in my exposure to this, right? Maybe you can say I have a particular lens as a psychologist and someone who works with people who talk about this. It doesn't work, certainly not well. It might work for a period, right? But there's something that happened that allowed this person to kind of lose track of themselves long enough to get to the strip club or get to the massage parlor or get to the porn, or right, they kind of go offline in a way and do something that outside of that moment they would say they don't do, or they don't approve of, or that's not them. So all of this needs to be backed up and addressed on that level. Like, what was that momentary offline that took place there? What went on inside of this person that allowed them to sort of act outside of themselves? That's individual work that I would encourage someone to go and do. It's far more effective to slow down and say, wow, I don't approve of strip clubs, and I don't think it's a good idea to go to those, and yet I allowed myself. Something happened, and I think it's important to take ownership. Like, I did do that. It's hard for people to own that entirely because of the shame that they'll sometimes feel, and the sense of that's not me, and so I don't identify with it, and I sort of want to kind of deny my agency in what happened there. One thing led to another, they may say. I just found myself there, but the fact is, nobody forced you, into the strip club or whatever. So some part of you took over and drove you down that path, right? There was some agency in that. Some part of you wanted to, even though most of you does not want to. So somebody's seeking individual therapy to process, like, how did I get there? Well, what just happened that I did that? What was going on inside of me that made me so curious about that, or drawn to that I'm morally opposed to it, and yet I went and did it, right? I brought myself there. I did that. I did do that, even though I'm not, kind of at ease with it, or I don't approve of it. That's vitally important to unpack, right? To understand more deeply, if you really truly want to get ahead of ever doing it again. In a perfect world, you start unpacking that before you even do it. You say, wow, I'm thinking a lot about this strip club thing. Or I should add, it's a lot of cultural, in the Orthodox Jewish community, it's a close knit, and there's a sense of just community and culture. So you learn things from people, and you kind of learn things sometimes from behind closed doors in a way, and you get a sense from other people. So you may think, I'll never go to a strip club. I mean, this exists outside of Orthodox Judaism also,
Sure.
but just the sense of like, oh, I go on I'm thinking of a man who went on a business trip, and he would never have thought to cheat, but then his colleagues are saying, oh, it's not a big deal. Our wives are not going to find out. It's just a one-time thing. And suddenly it starts getting normalized in a way. Or people can, in work environments, I'm thinking of men and women both who will be in work environments and suddenly kind of get a sense like, oh, well, here, we all participate in this. Here, there's a lot of secrets that we keep. It's just what it is. It's just how it is. And someone may really be quite vulnerable to that thinking and think, oh, okay, well, if that's how, I haven't worked maybe in a while, or, there's a sense of like taking cues from the folks around you. And if that starts to seem kind of run of the mill to the people around you, then you're going to start feeling like, is it so terrible? Or maybe I've been out of the loop. Maybe this is what everyone's doing and we just don't talk about it. And, so there's a lot of, there's that voice of what's going on around you, that starts to be powerful and make it hard to sort of see your own bottom line. Like, do I like this? Is that really how I feel? Is this really who I am? Is this really what I want to be? So to get to the next step of this, right, is like you do that work to figure out, how did I get there? How did I end up in the strip club or the massage parlor, etc. And then I'm not saying it's vitally important that somebody tells their partner about it. I don't think that's so black and white, but the relationship where you feel safe enough to tell your partner is a stronger relationship than, in my humble opinion here. There's a certain resilience and fortitude that relationship would have than the one where someone feels like, I really need to take this to the grave. If you're feeling like you're working on it, like you want to understand it better, like you feel bad, you feel ashamed, you feel remorse, you're addressing this actively, most partners would want to be in the loop about these things, and they wouldn't want you to take that to the grave. I think that's the case for couples who have a deep, open lines of communication. That most people would really rather know. And this is something also important to establish outright. Like some couples say, if you ever do this, don't ever tell me. If anything like this ever happens, don't ever tell me. Get ahead of this. That's our arrangement. I don't want to know things. So if you do something like that, I never want to know. You take care of it, get yourself a therapist, work on that issue, but don't bring it to my attention. It's the kind of thing couples can iron out before they're in that situation as well.
So I can't thank you enough for your time. I love the notion of moving beyond data points to learning. I think that has a great deal of applicability even outside of the world of infidelity, in all relationships, particularly in marriages. You could suffocate your marriage by focusing on data points, this kind of transactional, who did what last, who's doing more,
Right.
and working
it's
in
never ending if you do it that
never
way.
ending. Yes. My final question, and we'll see if we have time for rapid fires. I always end with rapid fire questions. But my final question, I'm sure you get it a lot. You kind of touched upon it. Is there any way to infidelity proof your marriage? What steps can somebody take who is dating? They're engaged. They just got married. They're newlyweds. Nobody wants to have a conversation. Say, you know what? We should see Dr. Bhowmik. Why? Well, she's an infidelity expert. Let's really, put on the right boundaries. Nobody wants to talk about this ever.
Sure.
What steps can an early stage couple take? Either they're dating, they're engaged, to ensure that they will have the strength as individuals and as a couple to protect themselves from falling prey to infidelity, to cheating, to adultery of any kind.
Couples rarely do this, but premarital counseling is a really beautiful way to start looking at those facts as they exist. I mean, 60% of couples, forgetting the exact, over 60% of couples come into couples therapy because of an infidelity. And that's how common this is. That's how, and that's just the demographic that comes in for support. So being on planet Earth about that is really important, saying, oh, we all wish we could say, well, that won't happen to us. Well, that'll never be us. I mean, we're so in love, or we're so strong as a couple, like we're not going to be vulnerable to that. Even those folks should say, let's go and talk about it. Let's go and, if they're willing to sort of look around them and say, people we know. I mean, I'm hard pressed to find someone who doesn't know somebody who's had an affair, been on the receiving end of an affair, is the friend that's counseling in the middle, is the child of someone who's had an affair, or there's so many constellations of this. So if we are kind of anchored in those truths, then even the couple who feels madly in love and incredibly, protected from this, it behooves all of us to start early and say, okay, we are about to commit ourselves for life. Can we, if it's not with a formal therapist, I think there's materials online. I'm sure there's ways to kind of start talking in a deep and honest way about what was your dating history? What was mine? Have you ever cheated on anybody before? Do you think that might happen here? What drew you to that relationship, or what drew you to any of your relationships, right? And just kind of unpacking, who have you been relationally, romantically, before you came to me, and who was I? And do we know all that about each other? And what are the things that, how do we intend to navigate these moments when, not just when there's like, attraction to another person, but just like when we are not seeing eye to eye, which is really the kind of like beginnings of someone sort of being, giving themselves license to have an affair. Is like, if the reason the newlywed doesn't have an affair is because the newlywed feels like all of their needs are so deeply satiated here in this union. I love this person. I'm attracted to this person. I have so much fun with this person. There's no room for anybody else. You know what I'm saying? There's no need for anybody else. Over time, these different indices start shifting, and you start shifting in terms of how you feel about you. So the other thing about the newlywed is, I feel so adequate, attractive, wonderful in your presence, right? I feel great about myself at the start of this marriage. And those are also shifting indices. So you sort of like feeling, keeping one's finger on the pulse around, how am I feeling about myself? How am I feeling towards you? And what's going on in terms of our communicating our feelings to one another about how I feel, like I'm not what you want, or not what I'm not living up to my own dream for myself, or I feel like I'm not the parent I should be. And I'm mad that you don't do X, Y, and Z. It's starting to, resentment is a big piece of this. These are sort of seeds that get planted, as I said. So are we getting ahead of talk? How do we talk? How deeply do we talk? How authentically do we talk? Are we afraid to tell the other one when we're unhappy or we're disappointed? And what do we do instead? And the more we kind of grasp those dynamics before they get, to a full volume and create that vulnerability for an affair, the more safeguarded we are. The more, I mean, this is too idealistic, but the more we can attempt to preserve that sense of wholeness and fullness that we felt on our wedding day. This ideally, sometimes even on wedding days, people have some deep apprehension, but ultimately, if you're choosing a partner for life, what was it that made that person be enough for you and made you feel enough for them? And how do we hold on to that sense of fullness and completeness? And when can we be mindful of when that starts to atrophy in this domain or that domain, in the parents' domain, or the, attractiveness domain, or the wealth domain, or the body image domain? Like, how are you doing? Are you checking in with yourself? Are you letting your partner know how is that person pleasing you or disappointing you? And what's the quality of your communication? So in a short, it's premarital counseling, or just deeper work on how do we talk to each other. Books on communication, there are tons of things like that, exercises.
Well, that's
Yes.
my final question. I usually always ask in rapid fire questions, but I'm only going to throw one in your direction because this is such a sensitive and real topic. Is there a go-to book that you recommend on? And I want to ask on two stages. One, somebody going into a marriage, somebody just beginning the commitment, and is there another book that you recommend for somebody who's already in the crisis?
So, sure, yes. And, there's a breadth of literature. So I'm just going to think of maybe the first top of mind. Um, yeah, I would say Esther's Mating in Captivity is a really good book to read on the front end of we're just getting married, we're just getting started, we're about to be monogamous for life, where we're aspiring to be monogamous for life. That book does kind of meet people in that place. And then there's so much, that I feel like, it seems to me, I mean, I don't know, I have a biased point of view on this because my work has been so much in infidelity, but I think there's a really rich literature on that, maybe compared to the couple who's trying to get ahead of things. There's a book called After the Affair by Janice Spring. I think she did a recent update to that. And that one kind of really does try to honor, the needs, I mean, it does justice to all partners involved, right? But my recollections of it is how much it does justice to the experience of the person on the receiving end of an affair, just how kind of gutting and unexpected and painful all of that can be, and what the other partner really needs to begin to do to start to fix what they broke, essentially. And then Esther has a book about this. I helped her work closely with her on a book called The State of Affairs. That book, I think, allows, it really does a balanced kind of deep dive on how is someone able to do it, right? What's really operating behind the scenes that someone's able to have that affair. Not neglecting the person who is deeply hurt by that affair, but really making room for, the fallible, real human pieces that are in all of us that are, that never once thought we would cross this line. And then ultimately we find ourselves crossing it, at least some of us. So yeah, and that's just a few that come to mind. There's so much. I wish I should have thought about it beforehand.
No, if I could only add
ones.
one, which you didn't mention, and not everybody enjoys reading, but I happen to be one of those people who can read an entire dissertation, but with your permission, I would include your dissertation, a grounded theory investigation of the subjective responses from partners and couples where infidelity has occurred. You do have a literature review. It actually is kind of, I wouldn't call it an easy read, but it's not.
Sure.
It's not as you could get through it. There's a lot of dialogue. There's a lot of transcription of what the couples are actually saying. I
Yes.
found it illuminating, and I am so incredibly grateful for your time. You are very busy. You were so kind and gracious that you reached out. I left a message. We have never spoken before, and
That's right.
I am so, so grateful for your wisdom, your scholarship, and your thoughts on this extraordinarily sensitive but essential topic, which is how we preserve the relationships that are most sacred in our lives. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Bhowmik.
You are so welcome. I'm glad as well. So glad you cold called me, reached out, and we connected, and we're here having this lovely chat. Thank you.
I am so grateful to Dr. Malika Bhowmik for taking the time to speak through incredibly profound thought on how to fortify our relationships, how to consider and think about our relationships when they are in crisis, and most importantly, how to reconcile after there's been a breach, after there's been a break, after there's been an erosion in our marriages. And I think anyone in any kind of relationship can understand why this is relevant, even if, thank God, for many, for most, I hope nearly all, the actual prospect of infidelity remains remote and should remain remote. But it was conversations like this that I walked away with real strategies and real perspectives to how to make every relationship in my life better, how to make better marriages, how to fortify our marriages, how to make them stronger, richer, and really embrace the commitment, the love, and the beauty that marriage is all about. I couldn't help but thinking in our relationship, in our religious lives, our relationship with God, Yiddishkeit itself is compared to a marriage. The Talmud says at the end of Tractate Tainus explicitly that our relationship with God began literally like biyom chasunaso. It was a chasana. It was a marriage ceremony. And when I was listening to Dr. Bhowmik talk about how relationships erode, it was hard not to think about our religious lives and our relationship with Yiddishkeit itself. And I was very taken by the notion of that imagined self, of how as our lives go on, we feel like our possibilities and our possibilities have dwindled and our responsibilities have grown. And a lot of people feel very stuck. They feel very trapped. They're almost like isolated within their lives and just imagining, what they could have been, what they could have become. And something comes along and like gives them that vitality, that energy, that excitement. And I think that just as that can be true in the erosion of a relationship between spouses, that can certainly be true in our religious lives, where there can be a stuckness in our religious lives. And we develop this imagined self of what we would be like had we not had the responsibilities of Yiddishkeit. In many ways, it reminds me like when we were young kids. I remember when we would go on vacation, like I was like 7, 8 years old, but I would like come up with like a fake name, and I was like try to imagine and present myself as if I wasn't Jewish, because I said, look, I'm not wearing a yarmulke, I'm wearing a baseball hat. No one will know I'm Jewish. I didn't quite understand that people would very much be able to tell I was Jewish, from the fact that my mother was probably wearing like a long flowing denim skirt in 80-degree weather. But to me, I was like, oh wow, I have this like secret identity. Call me Ace. Call me some cool name, Jake. It's gonna be my name on vacation. But I think even as adults, we have this imagined self that tugs at who we are, tugs at our identity, and we feel that there are possibilities that we wanted to explore. That as our relationship with Yiddishkeit, kind of goes on, you can sometimes feel stuck, and learning how to have those very real conversations and how to learn how to reimagine our relationship itself, how to insert that vitality, that energy, that excitement for the opportunities that we have within our religious lives, within Yiddishkeit, is part of what Teshuva is all about. Not necessarily going back to the religious lives that we may have fostered as teenagers, but finding a way to build the excitement, the joy, the sweetness of our religious lives, and not to just be on this autopilot treadmill of responsibilities, but taking all those responsibilities and commitments that Yiddishkeit demands and finding that joy, finding that excitement. And something that I found so beautiful was not looking at, the erosions in our relationships. I'm including Yiddishkeit, I'm including the relationships we have with our spouses, but something that Dr. Bhowmik really resonated with me is when she said, we're not looking at it as the choice between, I want to be married, or I want to, be perfectly faithful or unfaithful. But what somebody needs to realize is, what do I want more? What do I want more? I want more. I want to be married more. I want Yiddishkeit more than no Yiddishkeit. And there are choices that we can make that have such devastating effects that it can erode the very relationships that sustain us. And that if we're able to find a place in our hearts to reimagine those relationships, to find that joy in our Yiddishkeit, to find that sweetness and love with our spouse, to remind ourselves exactly what she said. Why are we in this in the first place? Why are we doing this? To remind ourselves about that joy that animated the initial decision, I think is a strategy that can heal and reconcile and even revitalize in a new way those most essential and sustaining relationships in our lives, to ensure that those closest to us and those who we want to be closest to us, even if sometimes we don't make the choices that allow that, but those who we want to be closest to us, the relationships that are most important to us, that kind of work, that kind of reimagination can ensure that those are the relationships that are able to sustain and nourish us for the duration of our lives. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you again to our series sponsors, Daniel and Mira Stokar. We are so grateful for your friendship, support, encouragement, and all the good things. It means so much to me. This episode was edited by our dear friend, Uri Westrich. Uri, thanks so much for your incredible work over this summer. I really, really appreciate it. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, that number is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.